It began with a city that refused to die. Metz rose from the rain-soaked hills like an ancient challenge thrown at the modern world, a fortress of stone and shadow, its walls scarred by centuries of war, its towers cutting through fog that swallowed armies whole. When the Americans first saw it through sheets of cold autumn rain, Metz didn't look defeated. It looked patient, as if it had been waiting for this moment, for this enemy, for this siege, and intended to make them earn every inch of ground they dared to take. And in 1944, time finally came for it. When American forces approached Metz, they saw a landscape that looked like an open invitation, wide fields, gentle slopes, roads that curved toward the city with deceptive ease. But beneath that surface lay a labyrinth of defences older than the nation attacking them, forts carved into hillsides, tunnels deep enough to swallow entire battalions, concrete strongpoints hidden behind thickets, layers of walls, trenches, casemates, and firing positions built generations earlier, now repaired, reinforced, and waiting. Metz did not welcome visitors. It endured them. The rain made everything worse. Sightlines collapsed into haze. Mud swallowed boots and stalled vehicles. Rivers overflowed, turning crossings into nightmares. Artillery shells misfired in the wet. Wires snapped. Maps became soggy, useless reminders of plans drawn in better weather. The Germans retreating toward Germany saw Metz not as a relic, but as a shield, one last chance to slow the American advance. They poured exhausted units into the forts, men who knew the war was slipping away, but who believed the city's ancient defences could delay the inevitable. Inside those concrete chambers, lit by dim lanterns and thick with damp air, they braced for a siege they expected to last weeks, maybe months. Outside, the Americans prepared to break a fortress designed not to fall. The first engagements around Metz were confusing, scattered, swallowed by rain and fog. Platoons vanished into the fields. Patrols returned with conflicting information. Tanks bogged down in mud so deep it pulled at the treads like hungry hands. Infantry advanced through terrain that seemed to grow heavier with every step. Every hill revealed another fort. Every fort revealed another obstacle. Metz wasn't a city, it was a puzzle built to punish impatience. Artillery hammered the outer defences, but the walls barely trembled. Infantry pushed forward, only to be pinned by machine gun fire echoing from hidden embrasures. Engineers struggled to blow passages through fortifications that had defied armies long before this war began. And still, the Americans pressed on. Slowly, painfully, they learned the pattern of the land. They found weak points between the forts. They took high ground inch by inch. They fought through villages that clung to the mud like wounded animals. They assaulted concrete positions that seemed to shrug off shells and flame. The battle felt endless. It felt heavy. It felt as though Metz had decided to test whether an entire army could be discouraged by stone. But the defenders were running out of time, out of ammunition, out of places to fall back, out of strength. One by one, the forts that had resisted generations began to crack. Mess halls turned into infirmaries, tunnels flooded, command posts crumbled under bombardment, and at last, after weeks of grinding exhaustion, the ancient city surrendered not in glory, but in a quiet, tired acceptance that even stone must yield when history demands it. Tonight, we return to Metz, to the rain that blurred the horizon, to the forts buried in shadow, to the soldiers who climbed slippery slopes with burning lungs, to a battle that moved not with speed, but with stubborn endurance. Before we move deeper, I want to imagine your moment to where in the world are you tonight, and what time accompanies you as you listen. Just describe it in your own way, and if these slow, gentle journeys into the past help you unwind, calm your thoughts, or drift towards sleep, consider subscribing. September 3rd, 1944. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Glass stood on a ridge overlooking the Moselle River, binoculars pressed against his face, watching the morning mist lift from the valley below. What he saw made his blood run cold, stretching across the horizon, rising from the forests like something from a medieval nightmare, were massive concrete fortifications, casements, ramparts, observation towers, each one larger than he'd imagined possible. His reconnaissance battalion had just raced 300 miles across France in less than a month, riding the wave of liberation, accepting surrenders from demoralized German units that could barely muster resistance. Now, For the first time since Normandy, they'd stopped. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. Between George Patton's Third Army and the German border, a mere 40 miles away, sat the ancient city of Metz, wrapped in a double ring of fortresses that had never, in 1,500 years of warfare, been taken by direct assault. Glass radioed his findings back to division headquarters, trying to keep his voice steady as he described what he was seeing. The response crackled back almost immediately. Hold position, await further orders, do not repeat, do not attempt to cross. Within hours, the entire spearhead of Third Army ground to a halt along the western bank of the Moselle. Soldiers who'd grown accustomed to advancing 10, 15, 20 miles a day suddenly found themselves digging defensive positions, stringing wire, establishing perimeters. The questions rippled through every company, every platoon. Why are we stopping? Why aren't we pushing forward? The Germans are on the run. We could be in Berlin by Christmas. But the officers who'd seen those fortifications, who'd studied the maps now being distributed, understood Metz wasn't just another French city waiting to be liberated. It was something else entirely, a fortress complex so massive, so thoroughly engineered, that it made the Atlantic Wall look like a sandcastle. The history of Metz reads like a catalogue of failed sieges. When Attila the Hun swept across Gaul in 451 AD, destroying everything in his path, he turned away from Metz after a single look at its defences. The city had never fallen to direct assault, not to Charlemagne, not to the armies of medieval France, not to anyone who tried. By the time Bismarck's Prussia annexed it in 1870, Metz had become a symbol of impregnability. The Germans, now owners of this strategic prize, decided to make it absolutely unassailable. Between 1875 and 1916, they transformed the landscape around Metz into what Kaiser Wilhelm II himself called the greatest fortress in the world. They built a double ring of forts, 28 major fortifications arranged in concentric circles 3 to 6 kilometres apart, each one a self-contained castle of steel and concrete. The outer ring covered approaches from every direction. The inner ring protected the city itself. Together, they created a defensive system unlike anything else in Europe. Fort Driant, part of the southern defensive complex, epitomized everything that made these fortifications so formidable. Its official designation was Groupe Fortifié Driant, but American soldiers would soon know it simply as the fort that couldn't be taken. The structure contained over 1,000 rooms spread across multiple underground levels, connected by miles of tunnels carved through solid rock. Its walls consisted of 15 feet of steel-reinforced concrete, designed to withstand direct hits from the largest artillery pieces in existence. An underground railway system allowed defenders to move troops and ammunition without ever exposing themselves to enemy fire. Ventilation shafts drew fresh air from locations hundreds of yards away, making gas attacks ineffective. Independent water supplies, electrical generators, ammunition magazines stocked for months of combat, every detail reflected decades of German military engineering. The fort didn't just defend against attack. It had been designed to make attack impossible. American intelligence officers pored over whatever maps and documents they could find, realizing with growing dismay how little they actually knew. The most recent detailed plans of Metz's defences dated from 1918, the end of the First World War. 26 years of German improvements, modifications, upgrades, all of it remained a mystery. They knew the forts existed, they could see them from aerial reconnaissance, but what lay inside, how many defenders, what weapons, what weak points, if any, nobody knew. The French resistance, so invaluable during the race across France, had minimal presence in Metz. The city had been German for 74 years, its population largely German-speaking, its culture thoroughly Teutonic. The few intelligence reports that did filter through painted a grim picture. The fortifications were fully manned, well supplied, and commanded by experienced officers who had no intention of surrendering. At his headquarters in Nancy, 40 miles west of Metz, General George S. Patton Jr. confronted a nightmare scenario that contradicted everything his military philosophy stood for. Patton believed in speed, in momentum, in the devastating psychological impact of relentless advance. His tanks had liberated more French territory in 1 month than any army in military history. His soldiers thought of themselves as unstoppable. The German army in France was shattered, demoralized, fleeing eastward in disarray. And now, because of medieval fortifications and 19th century concrete, he was supposed to stop. The meeting in his command post on September 3rd became legendary among his staff. Patton pounded his desk so hard that papers jumped. He demanded alternatives, bypass routes, anything but a direct siege. His operations officer spread the maps, traced possible routes. Every option led to the same conclusion. Metz sat astride every major road and rail line leading east into Germany. Its artillery could interdict any supply line within 15 miles. Its garrison could sally out against any force that tried to move past. You couldn't ignore Metz, you couldn't bypass it, you had to take it, or you had to stop. The broader strategic situation made everything worse. Third Army wasn't stopping because the Germans were ready to defend. It was stopping because Allied logistics had collapsed under the weight of their own success. The supply situation had become catastrophic. Third Army required 400,000 gallons of fuel per day just to maintain operations. On September 3rd, they received 32,000. The Red Ball Express, that legendary convoy of trucks carrying supplies from Normandy beaches, ran 24 hours a day, drivers pushing beyond exhaustion, and still couldn't keep pace. Every gallon of fuel had to be trucked 700 miles from the coast. Every artillery shell, every ration, every replacement part, all of it, crawled forward along roads, chewed to pieces by military traffic. Meanwhile, to the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group was receiving supply priority for Operation Market Garden, his planned airborne assault to capture bridges across the Rhine. Eisenhower's strategy called for a broad front advance, everyone moving together. Patton's rapid exploitation had outrun that strategy by 200 miles, and now he was paying the price. On September 6th, Patton met with General Dwight Eisenhower at Chartres to plead his case. "Give me 400,000 gallons of fuel," Patton argued, "and I'll be on the Rhine in 48 hours. The German frontier is wide open. We can end this war by Christmas." Eisenhower listened, then refused. The broad front strategy remained in effect. Montgomery's operation took priority. Third Army would receive enough fuel to maintain its positions and conduct limited operations, nothing more. The meeting ended with Patton barely containing his fury, convinced that Eisenhower's caution was throwing away the best opportunity to win the war. But there was another factor at play, one that nobody wanted to discuss openly. Patton couldn't just sit still. Politically, strategically, his reputation demanded action. An army that stops fighting starts questioning. The press wanted victories. Washington wanted progress. And there, right in front of him, sat Metz, the fortress that had never fallen, the city that symbolized German military pride. If he couldn't drive to the Rhine, at least he could give America the psychological victory of taking the impregnable fortress. The soldiers of Third Army, digging positions along the Moselle, sensed that something fundamental had changed. This wasn't a pause to consolidate gains or wait for supplies. This was the beginning of something different, something they'd never trained for, something the veterans of North Africa and Sicily recognized with growing dread. The war of movement had ended. The war of attrition had begun. Private Eugene Luciano, 5th Infantry Division, wrote home on September 7th, "We can see the forts from here. They're enormous. The old-timers who fought in Italy say it's going to be worse than Casino. Nobody wants to say it out loud, but we're all thinking the same thing. How do you attack something that's designed to be unattackable?" The question would haunt Third Army for the next 3 months. The answer would be written in blood. As September wore on, the full scope of the challenge became clear. Metz wasn't just one fortress. It was 28 major fortifications, dozens of smaller strongpoints, hundreds of bunkers and pillboxes, all linked by communication trenches and underground tunnels, all mutually supporting, all designed by German military engineers who'd spent 40 years studying how to make an attack impossible. American forces had captured cities before: Cherbourg, Saint-Lô, Paris, but those were urban battles, street fighting, clearing buildings. This was siege warfare, the oldest and bloodiest form of combat, a type of fighting that American doctrine had essentially ignored since the Civil War. The institutional knowledge, the specialized equipment, the tactics, all of it had to be relearned from scratch. And the Germans, sitting inside their concrete fortresses with stockpiles of ammunition and supplies, had all the advantages. They were warm, dry, and protected. The Americans would be attacking uphill, across open ground, against interlocking fields of fire that had been precisely calculated decades earlier. It was every defender's dream. It was every attacker's nightmare. And George Patton, the general who'd built his reputation on speed and maneuver, was about to spend 3 months discovering that some fortresses earned their reputation for a reason. August 31st, 1944. Sergeant James Mitchell of the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company had been driving for 14 hours straight when his convoy finally reached the fuel dump at Chartres. He climbed down from his cab, legs cramping, and watched as workers hand-pumped aviation gasoline into jerry cans, aviation gas, because that's all they had left. His truck was one of 6,000 operating in the Red Ball Express, the massive supply convoy that kept Allied armies moving. The route ran from Normandy beaches to the front lines and back, a 700-mile round trip that trucks completed every 48 hours. Mitchell had been making this run since mid-August, had watched the distance grow longer every day as the armies advanced, had felt the system straining under impossible demands. Now, loading fuel that would barely get Third Army's tanks 50 miles, he knew something had broken. The advance was over. Not because the Germans had stopped them, because logistics had. The numbers told a story of triumph turning into crisis. Between July 25th and September 1st, Patton's Third Army had advanced 270 miles, averaging 10 miles per day, liberating more French territory than any comparable operation in military history. They'd destroyed or captured entire German divisions, seized key cities, crossed rivers that were supposed to take weeks to breach. The German army in France was shattered. Wehrmacht units that had fought ferociously in Normandy now surrendered by the thousands, their command structure disintegrating, their supply lines non-existent. Victory seemed within reach, the Rhine River, the German border, possibly Berlin itself before winter, but every mile of advance created a logistical problem that multiplied exponentially. The Allied supply chain originated at Normandy beaches, where ships unloaded cargo onto temporary docks still being constructed. From there, supplies moved forward entirely by truck, because the French rail system had been so thoroughly destroyed by Allied bombing that it would take months to repair. Every gallon of fuel consumed by Third Army's tanks and trucks had to be transported by other trucks burning fuel to make the delivery. It was a system that could sustain advances of maybe 50 miles. It was now trying to supply armies 250 miles from the coast. The Red Ball Express became legendary, but legends obscure brutal realities. 6,000 trucks, 23,000 drivers, operating 24 hours a day on roads that were disintegrating under the traffic. Most drivers were African-American soldiers assigned to this exhausting, dangerous work in a still segregated army. They drove without headlights at night to avoid German aircraft, navigating by feel, staying awake through sheer willpower and terrible coffee. Accidents were constant, trucks sliding off rain-slicked roads, drivers falling asleep at the wheel, convoys bunching up in traffic that stretched for miles. Maintenance became impossible. Trucks broke down and were cannibalized for parts to keep others running. The official capacity was 12,500 tons per day. By late August, actual delivery had dropped to 9,000 tons. Third Army alone required 7,000 tons daily just to sustain current operations, fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything an army needs to function. That left 2,000 tons for all other Allied forces. Something had to give. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the staff worked themselves into exhaustion trying to solve an unsolvable equation. General Eisenhower commanded 3 army groups, Montgomery's 21st in the north, Bradley's 12th in the center, Devers' 6th in the south. All 3 were advancing, all 3 needed supplies, and the supply system could barely support one. The strategic debate that consumed August and September came down to a fundamental question: broad front or narrow thrust? Eisenhower's doctrine called for advancing on a broad front, everyone moving together, no exposed salients, methodical pressure along the entire line. Montgomery argued for a concentrated thrust northward through the Netherlands into Germany's industrial Ruhr Valley, give him all available supplies, strip everyone else, and he'd end the war by Christmas. Patton demanded the opposite, pour resources into Third Army for a direct drive through Lorraine to the Rhine and beyond. Both Montgomery and Patton presented their strategies with absolute confidence. Both claimed they could win the war in weeks. Both required more supplies than existed. Eisenhower made his decision in late August. Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's airborne assault to capture bridges across the Rhine, would receive supply priority. The strategic logic seemed sound. A breakthrough in the north could outflank Germany's western defences, threaten the Ruhr, possibly end the war before winter. But the decision created immediate consequences downstream. Third Army's fuel allocation dropped from the 400,000 gallons per day needed for sustained offensive operations to 50,000 gallons per day, barely enough for defensive positions. On September 2nd, Patton's tanks literally ran out of gas mid-advance. Units coasted to stops on roads, crews siphoning fuel from damaged vehicles to keep a few tanks mobile. The commander of the 4th Armoured Division reported that his unit was combat ineffective due to fuel shortage, despite being operationally ready in every other respect. The Great Pursuit across France, the advance that had seemed unstoppable, ended not with German resistance, but with empty fuel tanks. The meeting between Patton and Eisenhower at Chartres on September 6 became one of the war's legendary confrontations. Patton arrived with maps, plans, and absolute conviction. "Give me 400,000 gallons," he argued, "and I'll have reconnaissance units on the Rhine in 2 days. The main force across in a week. The German West Wall, the Siegfried Line, was barely manned, its fortifications incomplete. Third Army could punch through before the Germans recovered. We're throwing away our best chance to end this war," Patton insisted, voice rising. Eisenhower listened, then delivered his decision. The broad front strategy would continue. Market Garden had priority. Third Army would receive limited supplies for limited operations. Patton left the meeting furious, convinced that political considerations and British influence were sacrificing American lives. He wrote in his diary that night, "Ike is more concerned with balancing national interests than winning the war. We could be in Berlin in 6 weeks. Instead, we'll spend the winter bleeding for every mile." The strategic debate has consumed historians ever since. Was Patton right? Could Third Army have reached the Rhine in September? Intelligence reports from German sources captured after the war suggest the West Wall was indeed vulnerable. The German First Army, responsible for defending Lorraine and the Saar, reported having only 100 operational tanks on September 1st. The fortifications of the Siegfried Line, formidable in theory, were incompletely manned and supplied. General Alfred Jodl, chief of Wehrmacht operations, later testified that a serious Allied thrust across the Rhine in early September would have been catastrophic. But intelligence also showed German reserve divisions moving toward the front, the Wehrmacht's remarkable ability to reconstitute shattered units, and the approach of autumn weather that would ground Allied air support. The window, if it existed, was measured in days, not weeks. And even if Patton reached the Rhine, could he cross it? Could he supply forces on the far side? The same logistics crisis that stopped Third Army at the Moselle would have multiplied at the Rhine. What's certain is that the fuel shortage created a fatal delay that changed the character of the war. In early September, the German frontier was vulnerable. By late September, it was fortified. Those 3 weeks allowed German forces to dig in, to strengthen the Siegfried Line, to position reserves, to transform improvised defences into organised resistance. The delay also positioned Third Army directly opposite Metz, that fortress complex Patton had hoped to bypass. With insufficient fuel for a wide manoeuvre, with orders to maintain pressure on the Germans, with political and psychological need to show progress, Patton faced a terrible choice: sit still and be seen as inactive, or attack the strongest fortifications on the Western Front with inadequate resources. He chose attack. His chief of staff later wrote, "The decision to assault Metz was made for us by logistics and politics, not military necessity. We all knew it was going to be bloody. None of us knew just how bloody. The broader supply crisis had cascading effects that reached far beyond Third Army. Montgomery's Market Garden operation, launched September 17th with supply priority, ended in costly failure at Arnhem. The broad front advance, starved of supplies, bogged down everywhere. By October, German forces, given time to recover, established defensive lines that would hold until spring. The Red Ball Express, pushed beyond its capacity, began suffering catastrophic breakdown rates. By October, 40% of trucks were non-operational. Replacement drivers arrived with minimal training, accidents increased, the entire system teetered on collapse. Engineers worked frantically to restore French railways, to improve port capacity at Cherbourg and Marseille, to build pipelines for fuel distribution, but all of this took time, weeks, then months. The opportunity for quick victory, if it ever existed, was gone. Private First Class Robert Chen, a driver in the Red Ball Express, wrote home on September 15th, "We're driving 18 hours a day, and it's still not enough. The line keeps getting longer, the roads keep getting worse, guys are falling asleep at the wheel. We had 3 trucks go off the road yesterday, drivers killed, cargo lost. Nobody talks about it, But we all know the army's moving faster than its stomach can feed it. Something's got to give. What gave was the dream of ending the war in 1944. What gave was the mobility that had defined Allied success since Normandy. What gave was Patton's philosophy of warfare that speed and momentum could overcome any obstacle. Now, staring at the fortifications of Metz with barely enough fuel to sustain current positions, Third Army faced a different kind of war entirely, a war where logistics mattered more than courage, where supply lines determined strategy, where the tyranny of distance measured in gallons of gasoline would cost thousands of lives. The fuel famine had stopped the advance. The consequences would echo through the winter and beyond. September 27th, 1944, 05:30 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Jerry listened to the artillery barrage hammering Fort Driant and tried to convince himself this would work. His 11th Infantry Regiment had been ordered to take the fort, one of Metz's southern strongpoints, overlooking the Moselle River, designated as a limited objective that division intelligence assured him could be seized in 48 hours. Jerry was a careful officer, methodical, the kind of commander who studied maps and asked questions. He'd asked plenty of questions about this operation. What's inside the fort? How many defenders? What's the internal layout? The answers had been vague, estimates, guesses based on pre-war documents. Nobody really knew. Now, watching his G&F companies move forward through the pre-dawn darkness, he felt the cold certainty that this was going to be worse than anyone anticipated. The approach to Fort Driant looked deceptively simple. The fortress sat on high ground, its southern face exposed to the valley below, connected to other fortifications by communication trenches. American artillery had been pounding the position for 2 days, 500 shells of various calibers, enough high explosive to crater the landscape. Surely, command reasoned, that bombardment had neutralized the defenses, destroyed the observation posts, made the defenders seek shelter in the deepest bunkers. G Company, 1st Battalion, moved up the slope in textbook fashion, squads spread in tactical formation, covering each other's advance. They reached the first concrete wall without encountering resistance. Maybe intelligence was right. Maybe the bombardment had done its job. Then they found an entrance, a steel door blown half off its hinges by artillery, revealing stairs descending into darkness. Captain Howard Jackson, commanding G Company, radioed back, "We're going in." Those were the last calm words transmitted from Fort Driant for 3 days. The interior of Fort Driant bore no resemblance to anything American soldiers had trained for. The entrance stairs led down 30 feet into a tunnel system that branched in multiple directions. No maps, no lighting except what the soldiers carried. The flashlights marked their positions perfectly for defenders who knew every corner, every turn, every firing position. Within minutes, the Americans encountered their first resistance machine gun fire from somewhere ahead. Muzzle flashes in the darkness, ricochets screaming off concrete walls. Men went down, others pressed forward, returned fire, advanced to find the position abandoned. The defenders retreated through passages the Americans didn't know existed. The fort wasn't a building to be cleared room by room. It was a three-dimensional maze designed specifically to confuse and kill attackers. Corridors doubled back on themselves, staircases led to dead ends, rooms opened onto multiple exits, and everywhere, hidden in the darkness, German defenders who'd trained in these tunnels for months. By noon on September 27th, G Company was scattered through the fort's upper levels, squads isolated from each other, communication limited to shouting through corridors. F Company, following behind, got lost almost immediately. A wrong turn in the darkness led them into a section of the fort that hadn't been reconnoitred, where Germans emerged from side passages to attack from behind. The radios didn't work underground, the steel-reinforced concrete blocking signals. Runners trying to carry messages got lost or shot. Officers attempted to organize defensive positions. But where do you establish a perimeter when the enemy can appear from any direction, including below? Sergeant Thomas Mayer, F Company, later described the chaos. We'd clear a room, post guards at the doors, move to the next room. 10 minutes later, Germans would be shooting at us from the room we'd just cleared. There were passages we never saw, hatches in floors and ceilings. The whole place was designed to do exactly what it was doing to us. The German defenders' elements of the 462nd Volksgrenadier Division fought with the confidence of men on their own ground. They numbered perhaps 120 inside Fort Driant, a fraction of G Company's strength, but numbers meant nothing in the darkness. They let Americans penetrate deep into the fort, then counterattacked from multiple directions simultaneously. They used their knowledge of the layout to concentrate forces, hit isolated American squads, retreat before reinforcements arrived. They rolled grenades through holes in walls. They fired through murder holes, narrow slits designed centuries ago but perfectly functional with modern weapons. And when conventional tactics failed, they used gas. Not lethal chemical weapons, the Geneva Convention and fear of retaliation prevented that, but tear gas and smoke filling sections of the fort until Americans, many with inadequate or absent gas masks, retreated choking and half-blind. By nightfall on September 27th, Lieutenant Colonel Jea faced a nightmare scenario. He had 2 companies inside Fort Driant, scattered through tunnels he couldn't map, taking casualties he couldn't evacuate, holding positions he couldn't reinforce. Every attempt to organize a coordinated advance dissolved into chaos. Engineers brought demolitions to blow through walls, but the walls were 15 feet of steel-reinforced concrete charges that would demolish a building, barely scratch the fort. Flamethrower teams tried to clear tunnels, but the maze of passages meant fire couldn't project far enough to be effective, and flamethrower operators made obvious targets. Medical personnel couldn't reach the wounded. Supply parties got lost trying to bring ammunition forward, and night brought no relief. Because inside the fort, it was always night. The darkness was absolute, disorienting, psychologically devastating. Soldiers who'd fought in Normandy, who'd survived artillery barrages and machine gun fire, found themselves paralyzed by the claustrophobic horror of Fort Driant's interior. The situation deteriorated on September 28th. German counterattacks increased in frequency and coordination. Americans discovered that the sections they thought they controlled, maybe 5% of the fort's total volume, were under constant pressure. Defenders would appear, attack, vanish. The Americans tried following them, only to run into prepared ambushes. Casualties mounted 54 men on the first day, another 38 on the second. Medics worked in darkness by flashlight, triaging wounds, trying to stop bleeding, knowing that serious casualties might not survive the evacuation through hostile tunnels. The psychological strain became as dangerous as German bullets. Men saw movement in every shadow. Friendly fire incidents occurred when jumpy soldiers shot at sounds. Some troops, pushed beyond their limit, simply froze, sitting in corridors, unresponsive, having to be physically dragged back to American lines. On September 29th, Jea ordered a withdrawal. It took 8 hours to extract his men from the fort, a slow, dangerous retrograde through tunnels that Germans now fully controlled. Every corridor had to be covered. Every wounded man had to be carried. The Germans harassed the withdrawal but didn't seriously contest it, seemingly content to let the Americans leave. When the last soldiers emerged into daylight, Jea counted his losses. 64 casualties over 48 hours, roughly 1/3 of the attacking force. His men had penetrated perhaps 5% of Fort Driant's interior. They'd inflicted an estimated 12 German casualties. The operation was supposed to take 2 days. It had failed completely in 3. Division headquarters, receiving Jea's after-action report, faced an uncomfortable truth. If this was one fort out of 28, and if all the forts were this formidable, taking Metz was going to cost far more than anyone had calculated. The lessons from Fort Driant rippled through Third Army with the impact of a defeat, though officially no one called it that. Intelligence officers scrambled to get better information about the other forts, their layouts, their garrisons, their weak points. Engineers studied what little they'd learned about the construction techniques, the thickness of walls, the depth of tunnels, the positioning of defensive features. Infantry commanders realized that standard tactics were useless, that their soldiers needed training they'd never received. And throughout the ranks, from private to colonel, men absorbed a psychological blow perhaps more damaging than the casualties. We can't do this. The fortress is stronger than we are. If Metz has 27 more positions like Fort Driant, we don't have enough soldiers to take them all. Private Eugene Luciano wrote home on October 2nd, "We went into that fort thinking we were liberators. We came out knowing we were just targets. The Krauts built something we don't know how to beat. But orders were orders. Strategy demanded pressure on the Germans, and political considerations required that Third Army be seen fighting. Fort Driant would be attacked again, and again, and again. Each assault would incorporate lessons from the last. Each would bring new weapons, new tactics, new specialized units. But the fundamental problem, how do you conquer a fortress designed over 40 years, specifically to prevent conquest, remained unsolved. The Battle of Metz had begun, first blood had gone to the defence, and the men of Third Army, staring at the concrete casements of Fort Driant still flying German flags, understood that they'd entered a different kind of warfare entirely, one where American advantages in mobility and firepower meant nothing against walls 15 feet thick and tunnels that went down to hell. October 5th, 1944, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles. General Dwight Eisenhower studied the map with growing frustration as Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and General Omar Bradley argued across his desk. Montgomery's market garden operation had failed at Arnhem 2 weeks earlier, costing 17,000 casualties for minimal gain. Bradley's forces were bogged down across their entire front, making costly yard-by-yard progress through difficult terrain. And there, in the centre of Bradley's 12th Army Group sector, sat Patton's 3rd Army, stopped at Metz, bleeding itself against fortifications that showed no sign of falling. The strategic situation that had looked so promising in August now appeared deadlocked. German forces, given time to recover, had stabilised defensive lines across the entire Western Front. The window for quick victory had closed. Now Eisenhower faced decisions that would determine whether the war ended in 1944 or dragged into 1945 and beyond. Montgomery insisted on priority for northern operations. Give him resources, he argued, and 21st Army Group could push through the Netherlands into Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley, whose capture would cripple German war production. The Ruhr was Germany's arsenal, 70% of coal production, 65% of steel, most major weapons factories. Take the Ruhr, Montgomery claimed, and Germany couldn't sustain its armies. Patton countered that southern routes offered better prospects. Third Army could drive through Lorraine, cross the Rhine south of the Ruhr, advance into southern Germany's more open terrain. Both generals presented their strategies as war winners. Both demanded resources that didn't exist. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, had calculated that Allied logistics could fully support one major offensive or partially support two. Supporting three was impossible. Something had to give. Someone had to wait. The deeper problem was that Eisenhower's own strategy, the broad front approach, was unraveling under resource constraints. The concept made strategic sense. Advance everywhere, preventing Germans from concentrating reserves, applying pressure across the entire line, but the broad front required supplies that the logistics system couldn't deliver. By October, every Allied army group was attacking, and none had the resources to achieve breakthrough. Montgomery's forces struggled in the Netherlands. Bradley's armies ground forward at terrible cost. Devers's 6th Army Group inched toward the Vosges Mountains. Gains were measured in single-digit miles, casualties mounted into the tens of thousands, and everywhere the October weather, rain turning to sleet, temperatures dropping, visibility poor, favoured the defence. The dream of ending the war before winter was dead. The question now was whether Allied forces could maintain enough pressure to prevent German recovery. For Patton, Metz had become both strategic problem and personal obsession. Strategically, the fortress city sat astride Third Army's main supply routes, its artillery threatening any force that tried to bypass it, its garrison capable of counterattacking vulnerable flanks. Intelligence reported that German First Army Commander General Otto von Knobelsdorff had designated Metz a festum fortress under Hitler's direct orders to hold at all costs. Any Third Army advance eastward toward the Saar industrial region, and the West Wall required either taking Metz or leaving a heavily armed garrison in the rear. Neither option was attractive. But personally, Metz had become something more a challenge to Patton's reputation, a test of his methods, proof that his aggressive philosophy could overcome any obstacle. His diary entries from early October reveal a man caught between strategic reality and personal pride. They say Metz cannot be taken, that it has never fallen to direct assault, that I should bypass it. But a general who bypasses challenges is no general at all. Meanwhile, at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, the Führer was making decisions that would turn Metz into a bloodbath. His Festung doctrine, formalized in a directive issued September 19th, designated 26 cities and fortress complexes as strongpoints to be held regardless of cost. Metz was prominent among them. Commanders were forbidden from conducting strategic withdrawals, even when militarily sensible. Garrisons were ordered to fight to the last man, to tie down Allied forces, to make every mile cost maximum blood. The policy reflected Hitler's increasingly detached understanding of military reality. He believed willpower could overcome material disadvantage, that fanatic defense could stop Allied advances. His generals knew better. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander in the West, privately called the Festung policy madness that will cost us armies we cannot replace. But Hitler's orders were absolute. Metz would be held, its garrison would not retreat. The stage was set for siege warfare of a kind not seen in Western Europe since World War I. The time pressure weighing on Allied planners came from multiple directions. Weather reports predicted early winter, with the Moselle River entering flood season by mid-November. Once flooding began, crossing operations would become nearly impossible, and American forces were still fighting on the western bank. Intelligence photographs showed Germans reinforcing the West Wall daily working parties, stringing wire, digging trenches, positioning artillery, transforming what had been a partially complete fortification line into a continuous defensive system. Every day of delay meant stronger German positions, but perhaps most concerning were reports about German force reconstitution. The Wehrmacht, given breathing room, was displaying its remarkable capacity for regeneration. First Army, which intelligence had assessed at 100 operational tanks on September 1st, now fielded over 500. Shattered divisions were being rebuilt, with emergency conscripts, teenagers and older men pressed into service. The quality had declined, yes, but the quantity was growing. Time favoured the defence. Eisenhower made his decision. The broad front would continue, but with modified priorities. Montgomery would prepare winter operations in the Netherlands. Devers would continue pressure in the south. And Bradley's 12th Army Group, including Patton's 3rd Army, would conduct aggressive operations to reach the West Wall before winter fully set in. For Patton, this meant taking Metz, not bypassing it, not containing it, but conquering it. All 28 forts, all 12,000 defenders, the whole medieval modern nightmare. The mission's difficulty was acknowledged in the verbal orders Eisenhower gave Bradley: tell George to take Metz if he can, but not to destroy 3rd Army doing it. The caveat acknowledged reality. The order's phrasing suggested how impossible the task might be. The political dimension of Metz couldn't be ignored. By October, American newspapers were questioning the war's progress. The rapid advance across France had raised expectations of quick victory. Now, those expectations crashed against the reality of static warfare, high casualties, and minimal gains. War correspondents filed dispatches comparing the Western Front to World War I trench warfare. Public opinion polls showed declining confidence that the war would end soon. Pressure mounted on Eisenhower to show results. A major victory, the fall of a famous fortress, the capture of a strategically important city would answer critics, boost morale, justify the strategy. Metz offered that opportunity. Its history, its reputation, its very impregnability made it valuable as a symbol. If Patton could take the fortress that had never fallen, the propaganda value would be immense. If he failed, the costs would be measured not just in casualties but in public confidence. Third Army's position by mid-October reflected these competing pressures. Stretched across a 75-mile front, with Metz occupying the central 15 miles, Patton's forces were neither strong enough to overwhelm the defences nor authorised to bypass them. The 20th Corps, responsible for the Metz sector, consisted of 3 divisions: the 5th, the 90th, and the 95th Infantry Divisions, totalling roughly 50,000 men. Against them, German forces in and around Metz numbered perhaps 15,000, but those 15,000 sat behind fortifications that multiplied their combat power tenfold. The mathematics of siege warfare traditionally required attackers to outnumber defenders 3-1 for success. At Metz, where the fortifications were unlike anything in modern warfare, the ratio might need to be 10-1 or higher. Third Army didn't have 10-1, it had 3-1, and even that advantage was stretched across multiple objectives. The question haunting every planning session was whether the investment was worth it. Major General Walton Walker, commanding 20th Corps, privately questioned whether Metz's strategic value justified the predicted casualties. His operations officer calculated that reducing all 28 forts at the rate demonstrated at Fort Driant would cost the Corps 20,000 casualties, roughly 40% of its strength. Could those losses be justified for a city that, militarily, could arguably be contained rather than conquered? The debate never reached final resolution because political and psychological factors overrode purely military calculations. Patton couldn't be seen as inactive. Third Army had to contribute to the broad front strategy. And perhaps most significantly, after the failure at Fort Driant, after the humiliation of being stopped cold by concrete and steel, there was the simple matter of proving it could be done. American soldiers, American methods, American firepower against German fortifications' pride demanded a test. Metz would be that test. And the men ordered to conduct it understood, with the clarity that frontline soldiers develop, exactly what testing would cost them. October 3rd, 1944, Engineer Training Area, 5 miles west of Metz. Captain Robert Hayes watched his demolitions team prepare their latest test, a mock-up of Fort Driant's wall, constructed from captured German engineering manuals. 15 feet of steel-reinforced concrete, exactly matching the specifications that had made September's assault such a nightmare. Hayes had been an engineer for 3 years, had blown up bridges across North Africa and Italy, thought he understood demolitions. Fort Driant had taught him otherwise. Standard charges barely scratched the fort's walls. Bangalore torpedoes, designed for wire and fieldworks, were useless. Even 8-inch artillery shells, capable of destroying bunkers, only chipped the concrete. Now, watching his team place a corkscrew charge, a new design with shaped explosives twisted to concentrate force, Hayes hoped they'd finally found something that worked. The detonation was spectacular. Flame, smoke, debris flying hundreds of feet. When the smoke cleared, the team approached to measure damage. They found a crater 3 feet deep in concrete that was 15 feet thick. Progress, yes. But at this rate, breaching a single wall would take dozens of charges, hundreds of pounds of explosives, and time that attackers didn't have under fire. The failure at Fort Driant had triggered a frantic learning process throughout Third Army. Every unit that would assault Metz's fortifications needed specialized training, new equipment, tactics that nobody had taught them. Infantry squads practiced room clearing in mock tunnels, discovering that techniques effective in urban combat were suicidal in confined underground spaces where defenders controlled the geometry. Tank destroyer crews, whose 76mm guns were useless against fort walls, experimented with point-blank range attacks, driving within 200 yards of casements to fire armor-piercing rounds directly into embrasures. The results were mixed. At close range, tank destroyers could damage firing ports and observation slits. But getting that close meant running gauntlets of defensive fire that destroyed vehicles before they could shoot. Tankers calculated that for every embrasure silenced, they'd lose a vehicle. The mathematics of attrition warfare were brutal and simple. The evolution of mouse-holing techniques demonstrated American adaptability under pressure. Unable to advance through Fort Driant's corridors without devastating casualties, engineers developed methods to blast through interior walls, creating new paths that bypassed German defensive positions. The principle was sound why fight through a fortified corridor when you can blow through the wall and attack from an unexpected direction. But execution proved extraordinarily difficult. The walls inside the fort were thick, reinforced concrete, often 3 to 5 feet. Explosive charges had to be carefully placed, and sized too small meant ineffective detonation. Too large risked collapsing entire sections on top of American soldiers. Engineers practiced on test walls, learning through trial and error how much C2 explosive placed where would create a man-sized hole. Then they had to do it in darkness, under fire, with Germans on the other side of the wall they were blowing up. The casualty rate among combat engineers during October approached 15%, 1 in 7 killed or wounded, making it one of the war's most dangerous assignments. Flamethrowers emerged as perhaps the most effective weapon for tunnel fighting and the most controversial. The M2 flamethrower could project burning fuel 100 feet, creating temperatures above 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit in enclosed spaces. In the narrow corridors of Metz's forts, a single flamethrower burst could clear an entire passage, the fire consuming oxygen and creating temperatures incompatible with human life. German defenders quickly learned to fear the distinctive silhouette of flamethrower operators, but the weapons had severe limitations. Their range meant operators had to close to suicidally short distances. The tanks on operators' backs made them obvious targets. Shooting a flamethrower's fuel tank caused catastrophic explosions that killed not just the operator but anyone nearby. And there was the moral dimension. Burning enemy soldiers alive, even in warfare, troubled some American commanders. Unit chaplains reported soldiers confessing profound guilt about flamethrower attacks, describing dreams about men burning. The psychological cost of using such weapons was real, even when military necessity seemed to demand it. The arrival of heavy artillery marked a turning point in Third Army's capabilities. 8-inch howitzers and 240mm guns, the largest mobile artillery pieces in the American arsenal, began reaching Metz in early October. These weapons, firing shells weighing 200 to 360 pounds, represented the first artillery capable of actually damaging fortifications. The M12 155mm gun motor carriage, a self-propelled gun mounted on a tank chassis, could fire from protected positions, displace quickly, and deliver shells with enough mass to crack reinforced concrete. The 240mm howitzer, nicknamed Black Dragon, fired shells weighing 360 pounds to ranges of 14 miles. Direct hits from Black Dragon rounds could penetrate even Fort Driant's walls. The problem was scoring direct hits. The forts were designed with minimal exposed surface area. Most targets were small observation slits, ventilation shafts, doors. At ranges of several miles, hitting such targets required not just accurate guns but perfect fire control, spotters with clear visibility, and multiple ranging shots. The artillery expenditure rate climbed steeply. Third Army fired 500,000 shells in October alone, more than the entire North African campaign, with mixed results. Intelligence gathering became critical and evolved rapidly. The September assault on Fort Driant had proceeded nearly blind, with maps from 1918 and educated guesses. That couldn't continue. American intelligence officers initiated aggressive prisoner interrogation programs, offering German POWs better treatment in exchange for information about fort layouts, defensive positions, garrison strengths. Some prisoners cooperated, many didn't. Those who did provided invaluable details: the location of command posts, ammunition magazines, water supplies, hidden passages. Engineers compiled the information into updated maps that, while incomplete, gave assault forces far better understanding than they'd had in September. Aerial reconnaissance intensified. Photo interpreters studied hundreds of images, looking for patterns that revealed underground features, shadows suggesting tunnel entrances, discolored earth indicating concealed ventilation shafts. It was painstaking work with limited returns. The forts had been designed for exactly this kind of scrutiny, but every scrap of information helped. The question of chemical weapons generated intense debate at every command level. Geneva Convention protocols prohibited lethal gas, and both sides generally observed that prohibition, the horror of World War I gas warfare, remained vivid in institutional memory. But tear gas and smoke occupied a grey area. Technically non-lethal, these chemicals could render fort interiors temporarily uninhabitable, forcing defenders into prepared positions where American weapons could target them. Third Army's chemical warfare specialists developed tactics for pumping tear gas into fort ventilation systems, creating conditions that would drive German soldiers into surrender or retreat. The moral calculation was complex. Tear gas wasn't lethal, but in confined spaces with limited ventilation, it could cause panic, suffocation, injuries from soldiers crushing each other trying to escape, and there was the risk of escalation. Would using tear gas prompt Germans to retaliate with lethal agents? Intelligence suggested probably not, that German forces feared American retaliation more than they valued tactical advantage from gas warfare. Still, the decision to use even non-lethal gas troubled some commanders, who saw it as approaching a line that, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. Coordination among different combat arms, infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, chemical weapons specialists, required levels of integration that American doctrine hadn't emphasized. Each element had its role, but making them work together in real time, under fire, against an enemy fighting from prepared positions, proved extraordinarily difficult. Communication systems weren't designed for this kind of warfare. Radios didn't function underground. Telephone lines got cut. Visual signals were ineffective in darkness. Runners carrying messages between units faced every danger the battlefield offered. Without reliable communication, coordinated attacks deteriorated into chaos, with different units attacking at different times or hitting different objectives than planned. Third Army staff officers spent October developing new communication protocols, new command structures, new ways of integrating combined arms in siege warfare. It was learning on the job, each lesson purchased with casualties. By late October, Third Army possessed capabilities it hadn't had in September. Specialized assault units trained specifically for fortress reduction, heavy artillery capable of damaging concrete fortifications, engineers with demolitions scaled for reinforced walls, flamethrower teams practiced at tunnel fighting, tank destroyers with tactics for close-range fire support, chemical weapons for creating untenable conditions inside forts, and most importantly, hard-won knowledge about how the forts worked, how defenders fought, what methods succeeded and failed. But knowledge came at terrible cost. October's attacks against Metz's outer-forts positions like Koenigsmacker, Jeanne d'Arc, Saint-Privat cost the 5th Infantry Division 2,300 casualties for gains measured in single-digit miles. Each fort taken confirmed that American methods were improving. Each also confirmed that even improved methods resulted in casualty rates that, if sustained across all 28 forts, would effectively destroy Third Army's combat power. The question wasn't whether Americans could take the forts. The question was whether they could take them all before running out of soldiers. Private Eugene Luciano, 5th Infantry Division, wrote home on October 26th, "They keep telling us we're learning, that the tactics are improving, that the next attack will be easier. But I've watched this regiment lose 900 men in 3 weeks, and we've taken maybe 5 or 6 forts out of 28. The math isn't hard. If we keep going at this rate, there won't be enough of us left to finish the job. The forts don't care that we're learning. They just keep killing us, and we keep coming back because orders are orders, and this city has to fall. I don't know if we're brave or stupid, maybe both." October 8th, 1944, 0400 hours. Lieutenant Thomas Bradley crouched in a water-filled shell crater 200 yards from Fort Koenigsmacker, watching the artillery barrage that was supposed to make his assault possible. The 5th Infantry Division had been ordered to take this northern fort as part of Third Army's October offensive against Metz's outer defences. Bradley commanded 2nd Platoon, G Company, 2nd Battalion, 42 men, who'd been told this would be a limited objective, moderate resistance expected. Now, watching shells explode against concrete walls that seemed to absorb the impacts without damage, Bradley understood that division intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. Again, Fort Koenigsmacker sat on high ground overlooking the Moselle, its interlocking fields of fire covering every approach. The Germans inside Bradley, estimated maybe 120 defenders, had transformed the position into a killing ground that made Fort Driant look easy. When the barrage lifted at 0430 and Bradley led his platoon forward, they made it exactly 50 yards before German machine guns opened fire from positions that artillery hadn't touched. The assault on Fort Koenigsmacker epitomised everything that made October a nightmare for Third Army's infantry. Despite lessons learned at Fort Driant, despite specialised training and new tactics, the fundamental problem remained. You couldn't take a modern fortress without extraordinary casualties. Bradley's platoon went to ground in what little cover existed: shell craters, slight rises in terrain, the occasional tree stump. Return fire was useless. The Germans were shooting from concrete casements through narrow firing ports that presented almost no target. American artillery, supposedly providing close support, couldn't effectively engage the fort because observers couldn't see through the smoke and dust. Tank destroyers that were meant to suppress German positions got hit by concealed anti-tank guns before they could fire. Within 30 minutes, Bradley had lost 12 men, killed or wounded nearly 30% of his platoon, and hadn't advanced beyond that first 50 yards. Radio messages from other companies reported similar situations. The entire battalion was pinned down, taking fire from positions they couldn't see, much less destroy. This wasn't combat, it was execution. The October offensive represented Patton's attempt to break the stalemate through sheer aggressive pressure. If careful planning and specialised tactics hadn't worked, maybe sustained attack across multiple axes would overwhelm German defences. The 5th Infantry Division assaulted Metz's northern forts. The 90th Infantry Division attacked from the northeast. The 95th Infantry Division pushed from the south. All 3 divisions attacked simultaneously, stretching German defenders, preventing reinforcement of threatened sectors. The theory was sound. The execution became a meat grinder. German forces, fighting from prepared positions with clear fields of fire, inflicted casualties at rates not seen since World War I. American doctrine called for attackers to maintain momentum, to push through resistance, to exploit any weakness. But how do you maintain momentum when every advance is measured in yards, when every yard costs multiple casualties, when the enemy you're attacking is protected by 15 feet of concrete and you're exposed in open ground? Field hospitals 15 miles behind the lines were overwhelmed within 48 hours. Surgeons operated in shifts around the clock, triaging wounds under portable lights, making terrible decisions about who could be saved and who couldn't. Morphine supplies ran critically low. Plasma reserves depleted faster than supply convoys could replenish them. The triage tags, red for immediate surgery, yellow for delayed treatment, black for expectant death, ran out, forcing medics to improvise with scraps of cloth. Captain James Morrison, chief surgeon at the 128th Evacuation Hospital, later described the period as the closest thing to hell I saw in 3 years of war. We had boys with wounds that would have been survivable in a normal combat situation dying because we didn't have time or supplies to treat them all. The sheer volume broke us. We'd handle 30, 40 casualties in a day during the advance across France. Now we were getting 300, 400. The war had changed and we weren't prepared for it. The human cost extended beyond those killed and wounded in direct combat. Trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to wet conditions in inadequate footwear, exploded into an epidemic that October. Soldiers spent days in waterlogged positions, unable to change socks or dry their boots, feet rotting inside their own shoes. The conditions started with numbness and swelling, progressed to open sores and tissue death, and in severe cases required amputation. By mid-October, Third Army was experiencing 2,000 trenchfoot cases per week, more than combat casualties in some divisions. Medical officers pleaded for better boots, waterproof socks, rotation schedules that gave soldiers time to dry out, supply priorities focused on ammunition and fuel. The boots came later. In the meantime, perfectly healthy soldiers became casualties through administrative failure, losing feet because the army couldn't deliver proper equipment to frontline positions. October 13th brought one of the offensive's worst single-day disasters. Fort Driant on Metz's western perimeter had been under attack by the 95th Infantry Division for 3 days with minimal progress. German defenders, estimated at maybe 200 men, had held off division-strength attacks through superior positioning and intimate knowledge of their defensive sectors. Division Command ordered a final push, 2 battalions attacking simultaneously from different directions, overwhelming defenders through coordination and mass. The attack was supposed to launch at 0600 with artillery preparation. Communications failures delayed 1 battalion by 30 minutes. The other battalion attacked on schedule, unaware their support was absent. German defenders, not distracted by the second thrust, concentrated all fire on the exposed battalion. Then they counterattacked. German forces, emerging from tunnels that American intelligence hadn't known existed, hit the American battalion from 3 sides simultaneously. The attack, already faltering, turned into a rout. American soldiers retreated in disorder, leaving wounded behind, abandoning equipment, the unit cohesion that defines effective military forces completely shattered. The aftermath of the Jeanne d'Arc counterattack revealed how close some American units were to complete collapse. The battalion that bore the brunt of the German assault lost 360 men, over 50% casualties in less than 2 hours. Survivors straggled back to American lines in 1s and 2s over the next day, many showing signs of combat exhaustion that went beyond physical wounds. Regimental aid stations reported soldiers with a 1,000-yard stare, men who'd stopped responding to questions, who flinched at sounds, who couldn't or wouldn't sleep. The terminology didn't exist yet. PTSD wouldn't be defined for another 30 years, but the condition was real. Combat psychiatrists, the few assigned to Third Army, diagnosed exhaustion and sent men to rear areas for rest. Most returned to duty within days because replacement shortages meant units couldn't function without them. What rest they'd gotten wasn't enough. The psychological damage accumulated, invisible but debilitating. Leadership casualties posed their own crisis. The colonel commanding the regiment that attacked Jeanne d'Arc suffered a breakdown after the counterattack. He'd ordered the assault, despite misgivings, had watched it fail catastrophically, had listened to radio calls from surrounded companies begging for support he couldn't provide. On October 14th, he was found in his command post, staring at maps, unresponsive. His executive officer assumed command and immediately requested relief from the attack. Division denied the request. Operations would continue until objectives were taken. The new regimental commander, a lieutenant colonel promoted into a position he'd never expected to hold, wrote in his after-action report, "Continued attacks under current conditions constitute murder, not tactics. The enemy holds every advantage. Our soldiers display exceptional courage, but courage cannot overcome concrete and steel. I am reliably informed that this report will be disregarded. I submit it nonetheless for the historical record." Body recovery operations presented their own horror. The October fighting spread casualties across landscapes where recovery was impossible during daylight. Every approach to the forts remained under German observation and fire. Recovery teams worked at night, navigating terrain now thoroughly familiar from repeated assaults. searching for the dead by feel and smell. The darkness that protected them from German fire also meant they often couldn't identify what they found. Dog tags became crucial identifiers when they could be located. Many bodies couldn't be recovered at all, lying in positions too exposed, even for nighttime operations, or lost in the chaos of fighting where nobody quite remembered where someone fell. Graves, registration teams did what they could, maintaining records, establishing temporary cemeteries, treating the dead with what dignity circumstances allowed. But the scale overwhelmed them. By late October, some bodies from early attacks were still being found, identification difficult after weeks of exposure. The replacement crisis that had been developing since September reached critical levels in October. 5th Infantry Division was losing 400 men per week to all causes: killed, wounded, evacuated for disease, psychological breakdown. The replacement system delivered 300 per week, and the math was simple and devastating. Every week, the division grew weaker by 100 men. Company strengths that should have been 190 dropped to 160, then 140. Platoons designed for 40 men operated with 25. Squad-level leadership eroded as experienced sergeants became casualties faster than new ones could be trained. Replacements arrived with minimal training, often having never fired their weapons in realistic conditions, and were thrown directly into combat. Their casualty rates approached 50% within the first week. Veterans stopped learning replacements' names until they'd survived a month, emotional self-protection against the pain of losing friends. The artillery expenditure during October revealed both American material advantage and the limits of firepower alone. Third Army fired over 500,000 shells in 30 days, more than the entire North African campaign, more shells per day than some World War I offensives. The logistical achievement was remarkable. Shells manufactured in American factories, shipped across the Atlantic, transported hundreds of miles to artillery positions, fired at targets that often couldn't be destroyed. The expenditure achieved tactical effects. German defenders kept their heads down during barrages, communication trenches became impassable craters, some lighter fortifications were destroyed. But the major forts, the positions that really mattered, absorbed punishment that would have obliterated conventional defences and continued functioning. Fort Koenigsmacker received an estimated 8,000 artillery hits during its 12-day siege. When it finally fell on October 21st, American soldiers entering the position found walls pockmarked but intact, internal systems functional, and evidence that the garrison had surrendered primarily due to dwindling ammunition rather than structural damage. By October 25th, the offensive had gained approximately 3 miles and reduced perhaps 6 of Metz's outer forts. The cost? 5th Infantry Division alone suffered 2,300 casualties. The 90th and 95th Divisions each lost over 1,000 men. Total Third Army casualties for October approached 7,000, with Metz operations accounting for roughly 60%. Strategic analysts examining these figures calculated casualty rates that exceeded some of the Pacific War's bloodiest battles. Iwo Jima, infamous for its Butcher's Bill, cost 26,000 American casualties total. Metz, still far from complete, had cost 7,000 in 1 month, with potentially 2 more months of fighting ahead. The mathematics suggested that if operations continued at this pace, the final cost would approach or exceed major Pacific operations for a city that, strategically, might have been bypassed or contained. Private First Class David Chen, 5th Infantry Division, wrote home on October 26 a letter that military censors heavily redacted, but that captured the grinding horror of October's fighting. We take one fort, and there's another behind it. We lose men taking hills we'll probably give back in a week. The Germans know this ground, know where every gun should point, know where we'll attack before we do. Yesterday, I watched a machine gun kill 8 men in maybe 10 seconds, just swept across our line and they dropped. We took that position 3 hours later, found 2 Germans inside, both dead from artillery, 8 of ours for 2 of theirs, and for what? A concrete box we'll use as a latrine. I don't write about this usually because Mum worries, and there's nothing you can do about it anyway. But someone should know. Someone should understand what it costs to take a city that probably isn't worth taking. November 1st, 1944, Major William Bacon received orders that would give his name to one of Third Army's most specialised and dangerous operations. Task Force Bacon, an ad hoc unit combining combat engineers, tank destroyers, chemical mortar battalions, and veteran infantry, would attempt what the 5th Infantry Division's conventional attacks had failed to achieve. The complete reduction of Fort Driant using coordinated combined arms tactics developed from 2 months of bloody experience. Bacon, an engineer officer with experience in North Africa and Italy, understood that this assignment was both opportunity and potential career-ending disaster. If Task Force Bacon succeeded, it would validate new doctrine and provide a blueprint for taking Metz's remaining forts. If it failed, it would prove that even specialized forces couldn't crack these 19th century fortresses, and strategic decisions would have to change. Bacon gathered his officers in a command post 5 miles from Fort Driant and outlined the operation with blunt honesty. We're going to do things to that fort that haven't been tried before. Some will work, some won't. Some of you won't survive finding out which is which. But if we succeed, we save thousands of lives in attacks on the other forts. That's worth the risk. The composition of Task Force Bacon reflected hard lessons learned through October's casualties. 2 infantry battalions provided the assault force, the 11th Infantry Regiment, veterans of the September disaster at Driant, who understood the fort's interior better than anyone, and elements of the 10th Infantry, who'd fought at Koenigsmacker and other northern forts. Supporting them was the 818th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M10 and M36 tank destroyers mounting 76mm and 90mm guns. These weren't traditional anti-armor weapons in this context. They were mobile artillery pieces capable of direct fire at concrete fortifications. 2 engineer companies, the 7th and 14th Combat Engineer Battalions, brought specialized demolitions and the expertise to use them effectively. And critically, the 87th Chemical Mortar Battalion arrived with 4.2-inch mortars capable of delivering both high explosive and white phosphorus rounds with unprecedented accuracy. The 87th Chemical Mortar Battalion represented a capability that would revolutionize fortress warfare. Their 4.2-inch mortars fired shells weighing 27 pounds to ranges of 4,000 yards, with accuracy that allowed targeting features as small as ventilation shafts. High explosive rounds could penetrate 3 feet of reinforced concrete, not enough to breach fort walls, but sufficient to damage observation posts, destroy above-ground structures, and seal tunnel entrances. White phosphorus rounds created a different kind of problem for defenders. WP burned at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, producing thick white smoke and particles that ignited on contact with air. When WP shells landed inside fort courtyards or dropped through ventilation shafts, they created conditions that were psychologically devastating, even if not immediately lethal. The smoke reduced visibility to 0. The burning particles caused terrible wounds, and the chemical nature of white phosphorus meant it couldn't be extinguished with water. It would continue burning until the chemical reaction completed. German defenders had experienced nothing like it. Tank destroyer tactics evolved dramatically from the failures of September and October. Early attacks had kept TDs at standoff ranges, firing from positions hundreds or thousands of yards from targets. This approach was safe but ineffective at those distances. Even 90mm guns couldn't penetrate fort walls, and hitting narrow firing ports was nearly impossible. The new doctrine, developed through trial and error, called for close-range direct fire. Tank destroyers would advance to within 200 yards of their targets, supported by infantry suppressing German defensive fire, and engage embrasures and observation ports at point-blank range. The risks were enormous. German anti-tank weapons could destroy TDs at those ranges, and a single hit often meant catastrophic ammunition explosion. But the results justified the risk. 90mm armor-piercing rounds, fired at 200 yards, could punch through the steel shutters, protecting firing ports, could destroy the guns mounted in casements, could kill or wound defenders inside positions that had seemed invulnerable. Air-ground coordination reached levels of sophistication unprecedented in American warfare. The 19th Tactical Air Command assigned P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers to direct support of Task Force Bacon, with pilots briefed on specific targets and communications protocols, allowing 15-minute response times from request to bombs on target. The Thunderbolts carried 500-pound bombs for precision strikes and napalm for area attacks. Forward air controllers, ground officers with VHF radios, accompanied assault forces, directing strikes in real time as targets appeared. The system worked because of technology. Radios. Training pilots practiced close air support extensively, and necessity ground forces needed every possible advantage. During Task Force Bacon's assault on Fort Driant, airstrikes would deliver over 200 tons of ordnance in 5 days, each strike carefully controlled to avoid friendly casualties. Each bomb aimed at specific defensive positions identified by ground forces. The proof of concept came at Fort Platteville, a secondary fortification west of Metz that Task Force Bacon attacked on November 2nd as a rehearsal for the main assault on Driant. Intelligence estimated Platteville held perhaps 100 defenders and could resist for 3 days minimum based on October's experience. Task Force Bacon planned for 8 hours. The operation began with chemical mortar preparation, white phosphorus shells saturating the fort's interior spaces, creating smoke and chaos that disrupted German command and control. As defenders sought shelter from the WP bombardment, tank destroyers advanced to close range and systematically destroyed firing positions. Infantry moved forward under this suppressive fire, using smoke for concealment, reaching the fort's walls while defenders were still disoriented. Combat engineers placed demolition charges on doors and wall sections, blowing entry points. Infantry poured through, using mouse-holing techniques to bypass corridors, flamethrowers to clear rooms, coordinated team tactics that prevented the isolation and confusion that had plagued earlier assaults. By 1500 hours, 8 hours after the attack began, Fort Platteville's garrison had surrendered. 19 Americans killed or wounded, approximately 40 Germans. The contrast with October's battles was stark. The success at Platteville validated combined arms doctrine, but also revealed limitations that planners had to acknowledge. The operation required massive resource concentration: artillery, mortars, tank destroyers, engineers, infantry, air support, all focused on a single objective. That level of coordination worked for one fort. Could it scale to the 22 remaining fortifications around Metz? The ammunition expenditure alone raised questions. Platteville consumed 3,000 mortar rounds, 1,500 tank destroyer rounds, 50 tons of explosives, and 200 tons of aerial bombs. Multiply that by 22 forts and the supply requirements became staggering. Third Army's logisticians calculated that reducing all remaining forts using Platteville-level resource intensity would require dedicated supply priority for 6 to 8 weeks. Given the existing supply crisis, that meant other operations, Patton's planned offensives toward the Saar, supporting attacks by adjacent corps, would have to pause. The trade-offs were uncomfortable but necessary. Personnel requirements posed equal challenges. Task Force Bacon succeeded partly because it concentrated Third Army's best combat engineers, most experienced infantry, and most capable fire support coordinators into a single unit. Those specialists couldn't be replicated across multiple simultaneous operations. The alternative was sequential attacks, reducing forts one by one, using the same specialized task force, allowing time for rest, resupply, and incorporation of lessons learned. This approach was efficient but slow. German forces could observe American methods at one fort and prepare counters for the next. Time worked against attackers in siege warfare. Each day allowed defenders to improve positions, stockpile supplies, and potentially receive reinforcements. The tension between doing things right and doing them quickly defined planning for the final assault on Metz. The psychological impact of specialized tactics extended beyond battlefield effects. Soldiers in conventional infantry units, watching Task Force Bacon succeed where they'd failed, experienced mixed emotions: relief that someone had found effective methods, resentment that those methods hadn't been available earlier when their friends died in frontal assaults, frustration at the implication that their failures resulted from inadequate support rather than inadequate courage. Unit morale, already strained by October's casualties, required careful management. Commanders emphasized that Task Force Bacon's success proved the fortifications could be taken, that American soldiers were learning and adapting. That victory was achievable. What they couldn't emphasize, what nobody wanted to say openly, was that the learning process had cost thousands of casualties that better planning and doctrine might have prevented. The ethical dimension of chemical warfare remained contentious throughout preparations for the final assault. White phosphorus occupied a legal grey area not prohibited by the Geneva Convention when used for smoke or illumination, potentially prohibited if used primarily to cause injury. American forces justified WP use as creating smoke and denying positions to enemy forces, with the burning effects being secondary. German forces made similar arguments when they used WP. The reality was that white phosphorus caused horrific wounds, particles embedded in flesh, continued burning, creating injuries that were extremely painful and difficult to treat. Some American officers objected to its use on moral grounds. Others argued that WP saved American lives by forcing German surrender without prolonged combat. The debate never reached resolution. Operational necessity overrode ethical concerns. WP would be used because it worked, and in warfare, effectiveness often determines ethics more than the reverse. Private Eugene Luciano, now a corporal after attrition created leadership vacancies, watched Task Force Bacon prepare for the renewed assault on Fort Driant and wrote, "They figured it out. Took them 2 months and a couple thousand casualties, but they figured out how to beat these forts. The brass keeps calling it combined arms integration and specialized assault doctrine. We just call it bringing enough guns and bombs that the Krauts can't shoot back. It'll work. The fort will fall." But I keep thinking about September, about the guys who died when we didn't know what we were doing, when we went in with flashlights and rifles against concrete and machine guns. They died teaching us lessons. Now we're finally smart enough to learn them. That's war, I guess. We pay for knowledge with bodies. Some currency. October 15th, 1944, Ministry of Propaganda, Berlin. Joseph Goebbels reviewed the latest newsreel footage from Metz with satisfaction that was partly genuine, partly manufactured for the benefit of subordinates watching his reaction. The film showed German soldiers manning Fort Jeanne d'Arc, confident and well supplied, repelling American attacks with apparent ease. Much of it was staged. Cameramen had filmed defensive positions during quiet periods, added sound effects of battle, edited sequences to suggest continuous American assaults being bloodily repulsed. But the core narrative was true. Metz had held for 6 weeks against Patton's vaunted Third Army. That truth was propaganda gold, and Goebbels intended to mine it thoroughly. "The fortress city stands," he wrote in the script he'd deliver on tonight's radio broadcast. "American armor that swept across France has met German steel and concrete. Patton's boasts have become his humiliation. Every day, Metz holds proves that German will is stronger than American materiel." The script exaggerated, simplified, lied by omission, standard propaganda technique. But it contained enough truth to resonate with German audiences desperate for good news from any front. The propaganda value of Metz worked in multiple directions simultaneously. For German domestic consumption, the fortress city's resistance provided proof that the war wasn't lost, that American power had limits, that Hitler's strategy of defending fortress cities could work. Goebbels' ministry produced a steady stream of content emphasizing Metz radio broadcasts, newspaper articles, newsreels shown in cinemas across Germany. The message was consistent. American losses at Metz exceeded their entire North African campaign. Patton's reputation was destroyed, and German defenders were making the enemy pay an impossible price for every yard. Some of this was true, much was exaggeration. All of it served the purpose of maintaining civilian morale in a nation that had been receiving nothing but bad news from the Eastern Front for months. Metz became the Western Front's answer to Stalingrad, not a victory, but proof that Germans could still fight, could still resist. For neutral and allied audiences, German propaganda painted Metz differently. Here the message focused on American casualties, on the futility of assaulting prepared defences, on questioning whether the Western Allies had the stomach for the kind of warfare that taking Germany would require. Germany Calling, the English-language propaganda radio program, devoted multiple broadcasts to Metz in October and November. Patton's vaunted Third Army has met its Waterloo at a city they could bypass. One broadcast claimed, "American boys are dying in their hundreds for medieval fortresses of no strategic value. How many mothers must lose sons before American generals admit their mistake?" The broadcasts mixed truth with manipulation. Metz did cost heavy casualties, but characterizing it as no strategic value ignored its position astride major supply routes. Still, the propaganda found audiences. American soldiers listening to intercepted broadcasts reported that German claims about casualties weren't far off, which gave credence to the rest of the message. American censorship struggled to control the narrative from their side. War correspondents at Metz filed dispatches describing the fighting's intensity, the fortifications' strength, the slow pace of progress. Army public relations officers, tasked with maintaining domestic morale, found themselves censoring or heavily editing reports that were factually accurate but psychologically damaging. Ernie Pyle, America's most famous war correspondent, visited Metz in mid-October and wrote a dispatch comparing it unfavorably to the Monte Cassino fighting in Italy, tougher than Cassino, bloodier than Cassino, and strategically less important than Cassino. Censors killed the story. Pyle's protests reached Eisenhower's headquarters, where staff had to balance press freedom against morale concerns. The compromise: Pyle could write about Metz's difficulty, but had to avoid specific casualty figures and couldn't question strategic necessity. The sanitized version that reached American newspapers described brave soldiers, overcoming formidable obstacles, true as far as it went, incomplete enough to mislead. The divergence between official narratives and soldier experiences created cynicism that festered through the ranks. Men fighting at Metz could listen to armed forces radio broadcasting optimistic reports about continued progress and enemy resistance weakening, then look at the casualty lists and wonder what war the radio was describing. Letters home reflected this disconnect. Soldiers wrote about what they could, the cold, the rain, missing home, and avoided what they couldn't, the actual costs of fighting, the questionable value of objectives, the sense that they were being sacrificed for something nobody could adequately explain. Families reading heavily censored letters understood that something was being hidden, but not what. The gap between public narrative and private reality grew wider as October turned to November. German defenders' morale, monitored through prisoner interrogations and intercepted communications, showed the complex effects of propaganda on men actually fighting. Many German soldiers believed their resistance at Metz mattered strategically, that holding the fortress was buying time for other defensive preparations, that American casualties were unsustainable. This belief, reinforced by Goebbels' broadcasts, stiffened resistance even when tactical situations seemed hopeless. A German corporal captured at Fort Koenigsmacker told interrogators, "We knew we'd eventually fall, but we heard the Americans were losing thousands trying to take Metz. Every day we held meant American mothers getting telegrams. That meant something." The comment revealed propaganda's power. It kept soldiers fighting not because they thought they'd win, but because they thought their sacrifice inflicted costs that mattered. Whether those costs actually mattered strategically was irrelevant. Belief drove behavior. American newspapers in October reflected public confusion about the war's progress. Headlines varied wildly, depending on editorial stance and available information. Third Army advances despite stiff resistance. Metz fortress proves unexpectedly formidable. Patton's forces making steady progress. Questions raised about Metz. Strategy. Public opinion polling showed 62% of Americans believed in October that the war would end by Christmas, a percentage that had been 78% in August. The decline reflected growing awareness that the rapid advance across France had stalled. But most Americans still didn't understand why. The official narrative emphasized German resistance, weather, and logistical challenges, all true factors. What it downplayed was the possibility that strategic decisions, not enemy strength, determined the pace of advance. Patton's public image, carefully cultivated through 2 years of warfare, sustained damage that his staff worked frantically to control. Newspapers that had praised Old Blood and Guts for the dash across France now ran stories questioning why Third Army was stopped at Metz. Some journalists began asking whether Patton's aggressive style worked better in exploitation than in sustained combat, whether his talents were being wasted on siege warfare, whether different command arrangements might serve better. Patton, intensely conscious of his reputation and convinced that his methods would ultimately succeed, gave interviews emphasizing Third Army's determination and the fortifications' unprecedented strength. "Metz has never been taken in 1500 years, he told one correspondent. "When Third Army takes it, and we will, it'll be a historic achievement." The quote revealed Patton's framing. Metz wasn't a strategic necessity, but a historic challenge, worth taking because it was difficult, because conquest would validate his approach. The feedback loop between propaganda and reality created pressures that influenced operational decisions. German commanders understood that Metz's propaganda value meant Hitler would never authorize abandonment, regardless of military logic. American commanders understood that Metz's symbolic importance, both as challenge to overcome and as explanation for delayed victory, meant they had to take it, even if bypass was militarily preferable. Both sides were trapped by narratives they'd created. The actual soldiers fighting and dying became supporting characters in a larger story about national will, military competence, and strategic vision. That story demanded Metz be taken through direct assault, demanded that German defenders resist to the last, demanded that both sides pay whatever price the fortifications extracted. War correspondent Walter Cronkite, then a young United Press reporter, visited Metz in late October and wrote a dispatch that captured the propaganda dimension with unusual clarity. "Everyone talks about Metz as if it's one thing, a fortress, a city, a battle, but it's really 3 different things simultaneously. For the generals, it's a strategic problem to be solved. For the soldiers, it's a concrete nightmare that kills their friends. And for folks back home, It's a symbol being fought over in newspapers and radio broadcasts that have only passing connection to what's happening in the mud and blood here. The real story of Metz is that gap between symbol and reality, between what people think this battle means and what it actually costs. I can't write that story though. Censors would kill it. So I'll write about American courage and German fortifications and the steady march toward victory. I'll write the story I'm allowed to tell, not the story that needs telling. November 8th, 1944, 0300 hours. Corporal James Mitchell stood guard duty in a forward position overlooking the Moselle River and understood that he was going to die not from German bullets but from the cold. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that his breath formed clouds in the darkness, cold enough that the rain falling had turned to sleet, cold enough that his hands, even gloved, had stopped feeling anything. He'd been on guard for 90 minutes of a scheduled 2-hour rotation, and already the symptoms of hypothermia were creeping through his body. Uncontrollable shivering, drowsiness, confused thinking. This morning they'd found Private Collins frozen at his post, rifle still aimed downrange, dead from exposure without a shot being fired. The war had entered a new phase. Weather was killing as efficiently as Germans, and there was no defense against it. November brought weather that meteorologists would later classify as the worst in 50 years, a combination of cold, precipitation, and wind that transformed the battlefield into a frozen hell. Average temperatures dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, with nighttime lows reaching 15 degrees. Rain fell 23 days out of 30, often mixing with snow that accumulated in wet, heavy drifts. The wind, channeled through the Moselle Valley, made effective temperatures even lower. Soldiers who'd fought through hot Normandy summers and pleasant September weather found themselves completely unprepared for conditions that approached those of the Eastern Front. The Army's standard-issue combat boots, designed for temperate climates, provided minimal insulation. Overcoats existed but were in chronically short supply. Heating equipment for forward positions was non-existent. Men fought, slept, and died in conditions that would have been considered unacceptable for peacetime training exercises. Trench foot, which had been a growing problem in October, became an epidemic in November. The condition resulted from prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, blood vessels in feet constricted, reducing circulation, leading to tissue damage that, in severe cases, meant amputation. Soldiers spent days in waterlogged foxholes, unable to change socks or dry their boots. Their feet, constantly wet and cold, developed the telltale signs: numbness, swelling, discoloration, then open sores and gangrene. Medical officers understood the problem and its prevention: keep feet dry, change socks daily, rotate soldiers to positions where they could warm up. But battlefield realities made prevention impossible. Frontline positions couldn't be abandoned for foot care, supply priorities allocated to ammunition, and fuel left little transport capacity for dry socks. Rotation schedules assumed rear areas existed where soldiers could recover. The reality was that rear areas were often just as wet and cold as forward positions, merely safer from German fire. The Moselle River, which American forces still needed to cross for any offensive operation, became an impassable barrier in mid-November. Autumn rains in the river's upstream watershed caused water levels to rise 12 feet in 48 hours, the current tripling in velocity. Engineers' calculations showed that bridge construction in these conditions would take twice as long and fail twice as often. The few bridges that had been completed in October washed out, taking with them tons of supplies and several vehicles whose drivers misjudged the current. Crossing operations that would have been routine in September became potentially suicidal in November. Assault boats capsized in the current. Pontoon bridges broke apart. Even swimming the river, sometimes necessary when boats weren't available, meant almost certain death from hypothermia within minutes of entering the water. Equipment failure rates climbed catastrophically as temperatures dropped. Vehicle engines, designed for moderate climates, wouldn't start without 2 hours of warming, a process that required fires, which required fuel, which was already in short supply. Radios failed as batteries lost charge in the cold. Weapons froze moisture in gun mechanisms turned to ice, making rifles and machine guns inoperable until they could be warmed and cleaned. The M1 rifle, normally reliable, developed a tendency for the firing pin to freeze, rendering it useless. Crews learned to sleep with their weapons, using body heat to keep mechanisms functional. Tanks became mobile ice boxes, the steel hulls conducted cold efficiently, creating interior temperatures barely warmer than outside. Tank crews developed frostbite from contact with metal surfaces. Maintenance that should have taken hours took days as mechanics worked with frozen tools on frozen metal. German defenders, fighting from interior positions inside the forts, enjoyed massive environmental advantages. They had heating systems. Many forts were equipped with coal-burning furnaces that kept interior temperatures tolerable. They had dry sleeping quarters, protection from wind and rain, regular hot meals. While American soldiers shivered in foxholes filling with sleet, German defenders slept in bunks in heated rooms. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical. German prisoners interrogated in November consistently reported high morale despite their tactical situation. They were warm, dry, and aware that every day of deteriorating weather made American attacks less likely to succeed. Winter, they understood, fought for them. The supply crisis worsened exponentially as weather conditions deteriorated. Roads that had been merely damaged by summer military traffic became impassable mud traps in November. Trucks attempting to reach forward positions got stuck, requiring other trucks to tow them out, those trucks getting stuck in turn. A supply run that took 4 hours in September took 12 hours in November if it completed at all. Airdrops, theoretically an alternative, were impossible in low visibility and high winds. The Red Ball Express, already strained beyond capacity, began suffering catastrophic breakdown rates as trucks designed for paved roads operated continuously on disintegrating surfaces in terrible weather. By mid-November, 40% of Third Army's truck fleet was non-operational, awaiting parts or repairs that couldn't be completed in field conditions. Medical evacuation became as dangerous as combat. Wounded men lying in exposed positions could die from exposure before evacuation arrived. Ambulances travelled roads that were barely passable, taking hours to cover distances that should have required minutes. Field hospitals, already overwhelmed by casualties, now had to contend with patients arriving suffering from both wounds and hypothermia. Treatment priorities became impossibly complex. Do you warm the patient first or address the traumatic injury? Warming required time and resources. Treating wounds while the patient was hypothermic reduced survival chances. Medical personnel made judgment calls that would haunt them for decades. This man gets heat. This man gets surgery. This man gets morphine and prayers because we can't save everyone. The strategic calculation changed fundamentally once weather entered the equation. Eisenhower's planners had calculated that Third Army could reach the Rhine before winter if fuel allocations permitted. November weather revealed that calculation as fantasy. Even with unlimited fuel, operations in these conditions would be glacially slow and catastrophically expensive in both casualties and equipment. The window for major offensive operations was closing. Soon it would be shut completely, forcing Allied armies to adopt winter positions and wait for spring. But political and propaganda pressures remained. American public opinion expected continued progress. German propaganda exploited any appearance of Allied stalling, and commanders needed victories to justify casualties already incurred. The uncomfortable reality was that rational military calculation suggested halting major operations until spring. Political reality demanded continued attacks regardless of cost. Private First Class Robert Chen, Red Ball Express driver, wrote home on November 12th. Drove 18 hours yesterday through rain that turned to snow, that turned to sleet. Road conditions are beyond description. We're not delivering supplies anymore. We're just trying to get trucks to positions where they can deliver next week when the road's better. It won't get better. Weather forecast says more rain, more cold. My hands are so numb I can barely hold the pen to write this. We lost 3 drivers yesterday, not to Germans, to the cold. Trucks went off the road in the storm. Drivers couldn't get out. Hypothermia took them before anyone found them. This isn't war, this is survival, and we're losing. The bitter irony wasn't lost on veterans of Third Army's summer advance. They'd raced across France so quickly that they'd outrun their supplies, and now they were stuck fighting in the worst weather in 50 years for a city that had never been militarily conquered. The fortress they couldn't bypass because of logistics was now being defended as much by weather as by German guns. And approaching fast was December, when temperatures would drop further, when snow would deepen, when the Moselle would freeze solid enough to walk across but too unstable to support vehicles. Winter, the oldest force in warfare, had chosen its side. And that side wasn't American. November 7th, 1944, Third Army Headquarters. Nancy, General George S. Patton stood before a large-scale map of Metz, silence filling the room as his staff studied the plan he'd just unveiled. For 2 months, Third Army had battered itself against Metz's fortifications in frontal assaults that gained yards at the cost of hundreds of casualties. Now, with winter weather making conditions worse daily, Patton was proposing something audacious. Forget about reducing the forts systematically, bypass them, envelope the entire city in a massive double pincer movement that would cut Metz off from German support and force surrender through isolation rather than destruction. The plan required crossing the flooded Moselle River at multiple points simultaneously, advancing through terrible terrain in terrible weather, building over 30 bridges under fire, and closing pincers 20 miles apart while maintaining supply lines through a combat zone. His staff looked at the map, did the mental calculations, and understood they were being ordered to do something that doctrine said was impossible under current conditions. Patton's chief of staff broke the silence. "Sir, this is the most audacious operation Third Army has attempted. It might also be the most brilliant." What he didn't say, what everyone in the room understood, was that it might also be the most catastrophic if it failed. The concept was simple in principle, complex in execution. The 90th Infantry Division, 20th Corps, would cross the Moselle north of Thionville, 20 miles north of Metz, then drive southeast to cut roads and rail lines, feeding the fortress city from that direction. Simultaneously, the 5th Infantry Division would cross south of Metz, advance northeast, and link up with the 90th east of the city. The two pincers would meet, completing an encirclement that isolated Metz's garrison from resupply or reinforcement. German forces trapped inside would face a choice: surrender or starve. The beauty of the plan was that it avoided the worst of Metz's fortifications. The double ring of forts that had cost thousands of casualties remained a problem for the garrison, not the besiegers. American forces would be advancing through relatively open terrain against field fortifications, not concrete casements. Speed and mobility, Third Army's strengths, would replace the grinding siege warfare that had dominated October. The operational risks were extraordinary. Both assault forces would be crossing a river in flood stage, at night, under fire, in weather that made visibility nearly zero. Engineering calculations showed that constructing 30 bridges capable of supporting armour in these conditions would require 72 hours minimum 3 days, during which forces on the far bank would be isolated, vulnerable, dependent on supply by boat until bridges were complete. German forces, once they understood American intentions, could concentrate against either pincer, potentially destroying isolated units before reinforcements could cross. The timing window was impossibly narrow. Weather forecasts predicted a brief period of relatively clear conditions, November 8th through 10th, followed by another major storm system. If the operation didn't achieve breakthrough in those 72 hours, forces would be stuck fighting in conditions even worse than current. If it did achieve breakthrough, success would vindicate 2 months of planning and preparation. Intelligence assessments provided both encouragement and concern. German forces defending Metz proper, the fortress garrison, numbered approximately 12,000 men of the 462nd Volksgrenadier Division. These troops were dug into the best defensive positions on the Western Front and could resist for weeks or months if supplied. But German forces on Metz's flanks, the areas where American pincers would advance, were much weaker, perhaps 3,000 troops total stretched across 40 miles of front. Most were second-line units, static divisions with limited mobility and outdated equipment. If American forces could penetrate these weak flanks quickly, closing the envelopment before German reserves arrived, the entire Metz garrison would be trapped. But intelligence also noted German First Army had identified mobile reserves, armoured and mechanized units positioned to counterattack any major American offensive. Those reserves could reach the battle area within 48 hours. Everything depended on speed. The logistical build-up for the operation was staggering. Third Army accumulated 3 million artillery shells in forward dumps, more ammunition than had been available for the entire North African campaign. 500,000 gallons of fuel were stockpiled, enough for 3 days of sustained mobile operations. 10,000 tons of other supplies, rations, medical equipment, replacement parts, everything an army needed moved forward under constant harassment by weather and occasional German artillery. Engineers assembled bridging equipment, pontoons, treadway sections, anchoring cables, all the specialized material required to span a 200-foot river with bridges strong enough to support 60-ton tanks. The accumulation happened over 2 weeks, much of it at night to avoid German observation, all of it vulnerable to enemy artillery if discovered. That the build-up succeeded without major German interference suggested either excellent American operational security or German intelligence failure. Either way, Third Army would have surprise for the first 48 hours, at least. The division commanders receiving their orders understood the stakes personally as well as professionally. Major General James Van Fleet, 90th Infantry Division, had watched his unit take terrible casualties in October fighting for modest objectives. Now he was being asked to cross a flooded river, advance 20 miles through German-held territory, and link up with forces coming from the opposite direction all in 72 hours, all in November weather. His division was under strength. Many soldiers were replacements with minimal experience, and morale had suffered from October's grinding battles. But Van Fleet also understood that envelopment offered something frontal. Assaults couldn't, the possibility of decisive victory with acceptable casualties. If the plan worked, if mobility could be restored, the 90th Division might accomplish in days what months of siege warfare couldn't achieve. Major General Stafford Leroy Irwin, 5th Infantry Division, faced similar calculations. His division had borne the brunt of October's fighting, suffering over 3,000 casualties for minimal gains. The survivors were tough, experienced, and utterly exhausted. The November envelopment meant asking these men to cross another river, attack more German positions, advance through minefields and wire obstacles while carrying full combat loads in freezing weather. It meant operations at a tempo that would stress even fresh troops. But Irwin, like Van Fleet, saw the strategic logic. Frontal assault on Metz meant months more of siege warfare and tens of thousands more casualties. Envelopment meant risk, but also the possibility of ending the battle definitively. The choice presented that way wasn't really a choice at all. The timing decision reflected desperate calculation. Intelligence predicted German reinforcements arriving around November 20th. Fresh divisions transferred from other sectors to shore up weaknesses the Wehrmacht had identified. If American forces could complete the envelopment before those reinforcements arrived, Metz's garrison would be isolated and doomed. If the operation took longer, American forces might find themselves fighting not just Metz's defenders, but fresh German divisions in fluid operations where American supply problems and German defensive advantages would create new crises. The 72-hour window represented not optimism but absolute necessity. Anything longer meant the operation's premise, quick envelopment before German response, was invalid. German commanders, studying their own intelligence and preparing for American attacks they knew were coming, made their own calculations. General Otto von Knobelsdorff, commanding German First Army, understood that his forces couldn't stop a major American offensive indefinitely, but they could delay it, make it costly, buy time for reinforcements and for weather to further deteriorate American capabilities. Hitler's orders were explicit: Metz must be held, no withdrawals authorized, resistance to the last man. Knobelsdorff thought the orders were operationally insane. They would result in the garrison's destruction without achieving strategic effect. But Hitler's directives weren't suggestions. The garrison would fight, and Knobelsdorff would support them, and thousands of men on both sides would die for a city whose actual military value had become secondary to its symbolic importance. Patton, addressing his corps commanders on November 7th, made the case with characteristic bluntness: "We've tried battering through Metz's front door, and it's cost us thousands of casualties. Now we're going around to the back door, and we're going to kick it in before the Germans know we're there. This will be the biggest operation Third Army has conducted since the Normandy breakout. It'll be the most difficult, and it'll be the most important. Take Metz, and we open the road to the Rhine. Fail, and we spend the winter bleeding in the mud. There's no middle ground. Execute aggressively, maintain momentum, and we'll be celebrating Thanksgiving in a liberated city. Hesitate, and we'll be burying men through December." The speech was pure Patton, inspirational, demanding, honest about risks, without dwelling on them. What it couldn't convey was the terror individual soldiers would feel crossing a flooded river in darkness under fire, the exhaustion of advancing through mud and sleet, the cold certainty that many men listening to that speech wouldn't survive to see whether the operation succeeded. Those realities would unfold in 72 hours. For now, there was planning, preparation, and the thin hope that audacity could overcome the accumulated disadvantages of weather, terrain, and German concrete. November 8th, 1944, 0300 hours. First Lieutenant Thomas Harris crouched in an assault boat on the western bank of the Moselle River, listening to the artillery barrage that was supposed to suppress German defences long enough for his company to cross, Shells screamed overhead, impacts flashing on the far shore, the thunder so continuous it stopped being individual explosions and became one sustained roar. Harris commanded 1st Platoon, G Company, 358th Infantry Regiment, 90th Infantry Division, 42 men, who in 30 minutes would attempt to cross 200 yards of flooded river in darkness, while German machine guns and artillery tried to kill them all. He'd been through amphibious training in England, had crossed smaller rivers in France, thought he understood water operations. Nothing had prepared him for this. November water temperature, 38 degrees. Current running 6 miles per hour. Visibility maybe 20 yards in the pre-dawn darkness. And every man carrying 80 pounds of combat equipment. The boat next to his already had 6 inches of water from spray and rain. If they capsized mid-river, survival time would be measured in minutes. The artillery lifted at 0300 precisely. Harris shouted "Go" to his boat crew, and the assault on Metz's northern approaches began. The Moselle crossing north of Thionville was chaos from the first moment. Assault boats, powered by small outboard motors or paddles, pushed into the current and immediately discovered that rehearsal conditions hadn't remotely approximated reality. The current caught boats and threw them downstream, scattering what should have been organised waves into random clusters. German machine guns opened fire from positions artillery hadn't touched, traces visible in the darkness, rounds snapping past or punching through boat hulls. Harris's boat made it 30 yards before a burst killed the motor operator and wounded 2 riflemen. The boat began spinning in the current, men using rifle butts as improvised paddles, making progress through sheer desperation. All around them, other boats struggled, one capsized, men thrashing in water too cold for survival, most going under within seconds. Another took direct hit from artillery and disintegrated, but some boats made it. Harris has reached the eastern shore after 15 minutes that felt like hours, men scrambling out into mud and wire obstacles, taking cover from fire that seemed to come from everywhere. By 04:30, 90 minutes into the assault, the 90th Division had perhaps 500 men on the Moselle's eastern bank, scattered across a mile of shoreline, pinned down by German defensive fire, cut off from support because the river crossing was still under fire and follow-up waves couldn't advance. These were the moments that determined whether operations succeeded or catastrophically failed. Isolated infantry in darkness against prepared defences either broke or accomplished miracles through individual initiative and collective courage. Lieutenant Harris found himself commanding not just his platoon but elements of 2 other companies, all mixed together in the confusion. He organised perimeter defence, called artillery within 50 yards of American positions to suppress German counterattack, sent runners to locate other units and coordinate advance. German defenders, recovering from the artillery preparation, counterattacked at 0500 infantry, supported by machine guns emerging from trenches to push Americans back into the river. The close-range firefight lasted 30 minutes. Decided by grenades and rifle fire and desperation, the Americans held barely, establishing a beachhead 400 yards deep. By noon November 8th, the crisis had passed and the breakthrough had begun. Engineers had completed 3 pontoon bridges under continuous German artillery fire, working in waist-deep water, suffering 30% casualties but getting the bridges built. The first Sherman tanks crossed at 0900, immediately pushing inland to support the infantry. German defensive positions designed to stop foot soldiers couldn't stop armour. The breakthrough widened. By 1400 hours, the 90th Division had 2 regiments across the Moselle, advancing against German defenders who were retreating rather than fighting to destruction. The contrast with October's grinding battles was stark. In open terrain, using mobility instead of battering fortifications, Third Army's advantages in firepower and numbers became decisive. The race was on. Could American forces advance faster than Germans could bring up reserves? The breakthrough's speed exceeded even optimistic projections. By sunset November 8th, 15 hours after the initial crossing, lead elements of the 10th Armoured Division were 12 miles inland, having advanced through gaps in German lines that intelligence hadn't known existed. The terrain helped. Relatively open farmland compared to the tight urban and fortified spaces around Metz proper. The weather helped. The predicted 72-hour window was holding. Visibility good enough for air support and tank operations. And crucially, the German response was disorganised. Frontline units, undermanned and under-equipped, broke when attacked by combined arms task forces. Local commanders called for reinforcements that were still days away. Communications lines, cut by American artillery and raiding parties, left German forces unable to coordinate defense. What had been conceived as a dangerous river crossing was turning into exploitation warfare, exactly what Third Army did best. German headquarters responses ranged from denial to panic. Initial reports of American breakthrough were discounted as exaggeration. Frontline troops always overstated enemy strength. By midday, November 8th, the scale of the operation was undeniable, but Knobelsdorff faced impossible choices. Reinforcing the breakthrough sector meant stripping troops from Metz's garrison or from other threatened areas. Maintaining current positions meant accepting that American forces would envelope Metz from the north, while German forces could only watch. And Hitler's directives, as always, limited options, no withdrawals, defend all positions, hold Metz at all costs. Knobelsdorff issued orders for mobile reserves to counterattack the American penetration, knowing those reserves were still assembling and wouldn't reach the battlefield for 48 hours. Meanwhile, American armor was advancing unopposed. The human cost of breakthrough, though lower than October's siege warfare, was still substantial. The 90th Infantry Division suffered 358 killed or wounded in the first 6 hours, mostly during the river crossing and immediate beachhead fighting. Combat engineers building bridges under fire lost 60 men, roughly 15% of their strength. But these casualties purchased decisive results. 20 miles of advance in 72 hours, complete rupture of German defensive lines, and positioning for the southern pincer to complete the encirclement. The mathematics of attack had changed fundamentally. In October, the Third Army lost hundreds of men per mile gained. In November's breakthrough, the ratio was tens of casualties per mile. The difference was operational approach maneuver instead of attrition, exploitation instead of siege. Air support played crucial roles during the breakthrough phase. P-47 Thunderbolts of the 19th Tactical Air Command flew over 300 sorties during November 8th through 10th, attacking German positions, supply columns, reinforcements moving toward the battle area. Fighter bombers operating under forward air control direction could respond to targets within 15 minutes of identification, delivering 500-pound bombs or napalm on specific German positions. The psychological impact on German defenders was enormous. Being attacked from above while American armor approached from ahead made defensive positions untenable. Many German units retreated without serious resistance, preserving their forces rather than dying for positions that air power made indefensible. By November 10th, 60 hours into the operation, the northern pincer had achieved all its major objectives. American forces controlled crossings over the Moselle north of Metz, had advanced 20 miles inland, and were positioned to cut the main roads and rail lines connecting Metz to Germany. German reinforcements attempting to reach the battlefield encountered American blocking positions and couldn't advance. The predicted 72-hour window had held just long enough. New weather systems were moving in, but the breakthrough was complete. Now everything depended on the southern pincer achieving similar success. If both pincers closed, Metz's garrison was doomed. If the southern attack failed, northern forces might find themselves isolated, surrounded by German counterattacks, their success turning into trap. Private Eugene Luciano, 5th Infantry Division, received briefing on the southern assault on November 9th and wrote that night, "We watched the 90th Division cross the river and disappear into German territory. Now it's our turn. Same river, different sector, same terrible odds, but something's different this time. The brass actually seem to have a plan beyond attack and hope. They're moving us around the forts instead of through them, using the tanks the way tanks are supposed to be used, coordinating everything instead of just throwing us at concrete walls. Maybe we've finally learnt. Or maybe we're about to get slaughtered in new and creative ways. Either way, tomorrow morning we cross that river and find out if Third Army can still fight like we did in August. God help us." November 9th, 1944, 0400 hours. Captain Michael Romano stood on the western bank of the Sire River, south of Metz, watching the 5th Infantry Division's assault companies load into boats that looked impossibly fragile for what they were about to attempt. Romano commanded C Company, 2nd Battalion, 11th Infantry Regiment, the same regiment that had suffered catastrophically at Fort Driant in September. His men were veterans now, survivors of 2 months of siege warfare that had killed or wounded half the original regiment. They knew what combat cost, they knew what failure looked like, and now they were being asked to cross another river, attack more German positions, complete the southern half of an envelopment that required precise timing and perfect execution. Romano had read the operational plan, understood the logic, appreciated the elegance. He also understood that elegant plans died the moment first contact was made with the enemy. The artillery preparation began at 0415, shells arcing over the river to hammer German positions on the far shore. Romano checked his watch, gave the order, and C Company pushed off into darkness and uncertainty. The southern crossing encountered lighter resistance than the northern assault, but conditions were arguably worse. The Sai River was narrower than the Moselle, but faster, the current approaching 8 miles per hour in places where the river channeled through natural bottlenecks. Engineers had identified crossing sites based on pre-war maps that bore only passing resemblance to current reality. Autumn flooding had changed the river's characteristics completely. Boats launched into what were supposed to be calm eddies discovered raging current that swept them hundreds of yards downstream. Some boats made planned landings, others ended up scattered along the eastern shore, companies intermingled, unit organization dissolved, but the scattered landings created an unexpected advantage. German defenders, preparing to resist at predicted crossing points, found American infantry appearing at unexpected locations. The defense, designed for concentrated assault, couldn't adjust to dispersed infiltration. By 0600, 2 hours into the assault, the 5th Infantry Division had established multiple small beachheads along a 3-mile stretch of the sea's eastern bank. None were particularly strong. Most were under fire from German positions artillery hadn't destroyed, but together they represented penetration of German defensive lines on a scale that prevented effective counterattack. German commanders couldn't concentrate forces against a single crossing point because there were a dozen crossing points. Local reserves, committed piecemeal to contain individual breaches, were overwhelmed by the cumulative pressure of multiple penetrations. By mid-morning, the German defensive line along the Say had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent entity. Individual strongpoints continued fighting, the line itself had collapsed. The advance inland proceeded with shocking speed. The 10th Armoured Division, waiting on the western bank for engineers to complete bridges, couldn't wait for perfect construction. Tanks began crossing on improvised fords and partially complete bridges, accepting losses from mechanical failure and drowning to maintain momentum. By noon, November 9th, American armour was advancing into the French countryside south of Metz, encountering German resistance that ranged from determined to non-existent. Some positions fought hard, inflicting casualties, requiring combined arms assault to reduce. Others surrendered at first contact or retreated without engaging. The inconsistency suggested German command and control had broken down, that units were acting on local initiative without higher direction. The town of Delm, 10 miles south of Metz, fell to American forces on November 10th after fighting that lasted less than 3 hours. The contrast with October's battles was remarkable. Delmy wasn't fortified like Metz's forts. It was defended by field fortifications and improvised strongpoints that couldn't withstand coordinated attack by infantry, armour, and artillery. But more significant was the population's reaction. French civilians, suppressed under German occupation since 1870, emerged with tricolour flags that had been hidden for 74 years. They greeted American soldiers as liberators, offered information about German positions and troop movements, identified collaborators who'd supported the occupation. French resistance fighters, more numerous in rural areas than in German-dominated Metz, guided American forces around minefields and prepared ambushes. The human terrain had shifted dramatically from September, when Third Army had been advancing through recently liberated but still shocked populations, to November, when civilians actively supported operations. German supply columns, attempting to move ammunition and food to frontline positions, found themselves ambushed by combined American and French resistance forces. A convoy attempting to reach German positions near Falcamont on November 11th encountered a roadblock, took fire from both sides of the road, and surrendered after minimal resistance. American forces captured 230 German soldiers, mostly rear echelon logistics personnel, and 50 trucks loaded with supplies that would now sustain American advance instead of German defense. The psychological impact on German forces was significant. If supply lines weren't secure, if rear areas could be penetrated, if logistics personnel were becoming combat casualties, the entire German defensive structure was compromised. Fort abandonment accelerated as American forces advanced. 8 of Metz's southern forts, Positions that had resisted assault in October were evacuated in early November, as German commanders recognized that holding isolated strongpoints while American forces operated in their rear was suicidal. Garrisons withdrew toward Metz proper, abandoning fortifications that had cost American lives to attack, concentrating forces for the city's final defense. American intelligence, monitoring these withdrawals through aerial reconnaissance and resistance reports, understood what they signified. German forces were giving up defense in depth, concentrating for siege warfare in Metz itself. The envelopment was working. The pincers were closing. The question was whether they'd close before German reinforcements arrived. The advance rate, 28 miles in 72 hours, exceeded October's entire monthly progress. The 5th Infantry Division, which had spent October gaining 8 miles at cost of thousands of casualties, now covered 3 times that distance, with casualties measuring in hundreds rather than thousands. Veterans recognized the transformation. This was August warfare, rapid movement, exploitation of gaps, German forces retreating rather than contesting every position. The return to mobile operations did more for morale than any speech or commendation could achieve. Soldiers who'd spent 2 months fighting siege warfare, who'd begun to think the war would be endless, grinding combat for minimal gains, suddenly saw evidence that American advantages in mobility and firepower could still produce decisive results when applied correctly. German radio intercepts, monitored by American signal intelligence, revealed panic spreading through 1st Army headquarters. Commanders requested permission to evacuate Metz's garrison before encirclement completed. Hitler's headquarters refused, reiterating the fortress city doctrine: Metz must be held, no withdrawals authorized, resistance to the last man. Nobelsdorf, receiving these directives, understood they were condemning 12,000 soldiers to death or captivity for symbolic reasons. He issued the orders anyway because Nazi Germany's command structure didn't permit disobedience. The garrison would fight, the city would be defended, and thousands of men would die because political considerations overrode military logic. By November 13th, American forces controlled terrain south and east of Metz, having advanced through German defensive lines that were supposed to require weeks to penetrate. The southern pincer had achieved all objectives on schedule. Now the 2 American pincers, northern and southern, were positioned to meet, completing the encirclement that would isolate Metz's garrison from resupply, reinforcement, or escape. The success validated Patton's operational concept: bypass the strongest fortifications, envelope them, force surrender through isolation rather than destruction. But the operation also revealed uncomfortable truths about October's siege warfare. If envelopment could achieve in days what frontal assault couldn't achieve in months, why had Third Army spent October battering against fortifications? The question would haunt after-action reviews and historical analysis for decades. For now, there was only the operational reality. Metz was about to be surrounded, and the German garrison had no options left except fight or surrender. Corporal James Mitchell, having survived the November 8th crossing and the subsequent advance, wrote home on November 13th, "We've done in 5 days what we couldn't do in 2 months. The difference is we're fighting Germans in the open instead of Germans in concrete boxes." Turns out American soldiers are pretty good at mobile warfare when we're allowed to practice it. The forts are still there, we can see them from here, big concrete things with German flags flying, but now they're behind us, cut off, irrelevant. The Krauts inside can either surrender or starve. Either way, we don't have to assault them. That's the best news I've heard since this battle started. Maybe the war's finally moving again. Maybe we can finish this before Christmas after all. November 18th, 1944, 1500 hours. American forces from the 90th Infantry Division advancing south and the 5th Infantry Division advancing north met at a destroyed bridge on the Metz-Thionville Road, completing the encirclement of Metz. The handshake between officers from the 2 divisions was photographed for newspapers back home, a symbol of success after 2 months of frustration. But the photograph couldn't capture what the encirclement meant for 12,000 German soldiers and 48,000 French civilians now trapped inside a city that had become a prison. The noose had tightened. Now came the question of whether to strangle slowly through siege or assault quickly and accept the casualties that urban combat would cost. Inside Metz, General Heinrich Kittel, commanding the fortress garrison, read Hitler's latest directive, ordering defense to the last man, and understood that he'd been handed an impossible mission. His soldiers were cut off from resupply. His heavy weapons were running low on ammunition. His food stocks would last perhaps 10 days, and he'd been ordered to hold indefinitely against an enemy that now surrounded him completely. The encirclement perimeter stretched 18 miles around Metz, defended by American forces that finally held numerical and firepower superiority adequate for the mission. 6-1 advantage in troops, 10-1 in artillery, absolute dominance in armor and air support. The garrison had nowhere to retreat, no reinforcements coming, no resupply possible. By every conventional military calculation, surrender was the rational choice. But Nazi Germany's military didn't operate on conventional calculations. Kittel's orders were explicit. Hold Metz, tie down American forces, inflict maximum casualties, fight until ammunition exhausted, then fight with rifles and grenades, and if necessary make the Americans kill every defender. Retreat or surrender meant court-martial and execution for dereliction. The political system had created conditions where rational military decisions were punishable by death. So the garrison would fight, not because fighting made sense, but because not fighting meant certain execution versus probable death in combat. The civilian population of 48,000 French citizens became hostages to a military situation they couldn't control. Most had remained in Metz during the battle, sheltering in basements and the city's extensive underground infrastructure. Now they faced a terrible choice. Stay in a city about to become a battlefield, with food supplies running low and water systems damaged, or try to escape through American lines and risk being shot as German soldiers attempting infiltration. American commanders, aware of the civilian situation, established procedures for evacuation, designated crossing points where civilians could leave the city under white flag. Hundreds took the opportunity, streaming out of Metz with whatever possessions they could carry, telling American intelligence officers about conditions inside the city. The stories were grim. Limited food, no electricity in most areas, hospitals overwhelmed with civilian casualties from earlier bombardments, typhus outbreak beginning in the crowded underground shelters. The humanitarian crisis created dilemmas that military training didn't address. Should American forces allow food into the city to prevent civilian starvation, knowing that food would also sustain German defenders? Should they accept unconditional surrender from garrison forces, or demand that Germans first release all French civilians? The Geneva Convention had provisions for civilians in combat zones, but those provisions assumed rational actors negotiating in good faith. Nazi Germany's fortress doctrine explicitly used civilian presence as shield against Allied attack, calculating that democracies would be reluctant to inflict civilian casualties, while totalitarian regimes had no such constraints. American commanders, aware they were being manipulated but unable to ignore civilian suffering, authorized limited food shipments through Red Cross intermediaries. The food helped civilians but also extended the garrison's ability to resist. Every decision involved impossible ethical calculations. The German garrison's distribution reflected defensive priorities. 19 forts still held by forces ranging from 50 to 300 men each, most now isolated from central command and functioning autonomously. The city centre contained the main garrison, approximately 6,000 troops, plus command elements, hospitals, supply depots. Communication between forts and central command had degraded to occasional radio messages and runners attempting to traverse areas now controlled by American forces. Some forts had no communication at all, their defenders fighting on because they knew nothing except that orders were to resist. The isolation created situations where individual fort commanders made decisions that determined hundreds of lives, surrender early and face potential execution for cowardice, or fight to destruction and watch men die for positions that couldn't affect the battle's outcome. American artillery, now positioned in 360-degree coverage around Metz, began systematic bombardment of remaining German positions. 1,200 guns, from 75mm pack howitzers to 240mm Black Dragons, fired coordinated patterns designed to suppress German fire, destroy defensive positions, and create psychological pressure for surrender. The bombardment consumed ammunition at rates that strained even American logistics. 10,000 shells per hour during intensive periods, sustained over days. The city that had stood for 1,500 years began to physically disintegrate under the weight of explosives. Buildings collapsed, streets filled with rubble, fires burned unchecked because water mains were destroyed. Civilians sheltering underground felt the concussions, the constant shaking, the terror that the next shell might penetrate to their refuge. November 19th brought German attempts to break out of the encirclement, desperate operations by units unwilling to accept slow starvation or surrender. A battalion-strength force attempted to breach American lines east of Metz, hoping to reach German positions beyond the encirclement. The breakout lasted 3 hours. American forces, alerted by observation posts and aerial reconnaissance, concentrated armor and artillery against the penetration. Tank destroyers firing at point-blank range destroyed the improvised armored column trucks, and half-tracks pressed into service as ersatz tanks. Infantry, attempting to advance on foot, encountered machine gun fire from prepared American positions. Of 400 Germans attempting the breakout, perhaps 50 escaped. 300 died in the attempt. The remainder retreated into Metz, understanding now that escape was impossible. They were trapped, and their options had reduced to surrender or death. The psychological pressure on the garrison intensified as supply situation deteriorated. German soldiers, who'd begun the siege with reasonable rations, now received 1 meal per day of rapidly diminishing quality and quantity. Medical supplies depleted faster than casualties, accumulated bandages, morphine, antiseptics, all running out. Garrison hospitals, treating both military and civilian casualties, made triage decisions based not on severity of wounds, but on likelihood that limited medical supplies would make a difference. The walking wounded went untreated. Those requiring surgery often died because anesthesia was unavailable. Doctors operated by candlelight when electrical generators ran out of fuel. The conditions deteriorated toward medieval siege warfare standards: disease, starvation, and despair, killing as efficiently as American shells. Fort Driant's story reached its anticlimax on November 20th. Task Force Bacon, prepared for the assault that would finally reduce the fortress that had resisted since September, approached the position expecting the fight of their lives. Instead, they found abandoned positions. The garrison had evacuated days earlier, withdrawing into Metz proper rather than dying in isolated fort. American soldiers entering Fort Driant discovered elaborate dummy positions, mannequins dressed in German uniforms, weapons made of wood, entire sections designed to appear occupied to aerial reconnaissance. The October assaults that had cost hundreds of casualties had been attacking positions the Germans were already preparing to abandon. The revelation was simultaneously relieving no assault necessary and infuriating all those casualties for a position the enemy considered expendable. The fort that had symbolized Metz's impregnability fell without a shot in November, abandoned by defenders who'd killed hundreds protecting it in September and October. The encirclement's completion changed the battle's timeline from indefinite to calculable. German forces could resist perhaps 10 more days before ammunition and food exhausted completely. American forces could sustain the siege indefinitely, though political pressure demanded quicker resolution. The compromise was preparing for final assault while offering surrender terms designed to be militarily acceptable but politically face-saving. American commanders understood that German officers feared execution more than combat death. Surrender terms that guaranteed power treatment consistent with Geneva Convention, that didn't characterize surrender as cowardice, might be accepted where simple demands to capitulate would be refused. The psychological warfare began. Loudspeaker broadcasts in German explaining surrender procedures, leaflets dropped into the city guaranteeing humane treatment, messages sent through Red Cross intermediaries outlining terms. Some German soldiers surrendered individually or in small groups. The garrison as a whole continued resisting, bound by orders, fear, and the military culture that prioritized obedience over survival. Private First Class David Chen, positioned in the encirclement line, wrote home on November 20th, "We've surrounded the city, the Germans are trapped. Eventually they'll run out of food and bullets and they'll have to surrender. But eventually might mean weeks, might mean we have to go in and dig them out house by house. Nobody wants that. Urban combat is worse than anything we've experienced. But if that's what it takes to end this, that's what we'll do. At least now the end is visible. 2 months ago we were attacking forts that seemed unbeatable, losing men for yards of ground. Now the Germans are besieged and we're the ones controlling the situation. It's not victory yet, but it's close enough to see. That's something." November 19th, 1944, 2100 hours. The artillery preparation for the final assault on Metz began with a sound that survivors would describe as the earth screaming. 1,000 guns firing simultaneously, 10,000 shells per hour, a bombardment that exceeded anything Third Army had delivered in 3 months of siege warfare. The city disappeared under smoke and flame. Buildings that had stood for centuries disintegrated in seconds. The ground shook continuously, glass shattering miles away. Civilians in underground shelters praying the concrete above them would hold. This wasn't precision fire aimed at military targets. This was annihilation fire designed to break the will of defenders through sheer overwhelming violence. It lasted 12 hours. When it finally stopped at 0900 November 20th, silence fell across Metz like a physical presence. Then the infantry moved forward. The assault plan reflected everything Third Army had learned, at terrible cost since September. No frontal attacks on remaining forts, those would be bypassed or reduced by specialized units using proven tactics. The main effort focused on Metz's city centre, where the garrison's command structure, supply depots, and defensive coordination existed. Destroy that, and outlying forts would surrender from isolation and loss of purpose. The 5th Infantry Division attacked from the south, the 90th from the north, the 95th from the west. 3 division-strength assaults converging on a city whose defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, cut off from resupply, and exhausted from weeks of siege. The outcome wasn't in doubt. The question was cost: how many casualties would taking Metz inflict on attackers, and how much of the city would survive the process? Urban combat proceeded with methodical brutality. American tactics emphasized firepower over maneuver rather than clear buildings, room by room. Infantry called in tank destroyers to fire point-blank into structures, collapsing them on defenders inside. Flamethrower teams burned out basements where Germans had established positions. Artillery, firing at danger-close ranges, demolished entire city blocks to eliminate strong points. The destruction was comprehensive and deliberate. Soldiers who'd spent October dying to take individual forts now watched entire neighborhoods destroyed in hours. The efficiency came at cost to the city itself, Metz's ancient architecture, its medieval churches, its irreplaceable historical structures, all became collateral damage in the pursuit of military objectives. French civilians who'd hoped for liberation watched their city being obliterated to save it. The cathedral area became the focus of the fiercest fighting. German defenders, recognizing they were making last stands, fortified Metz Cathedral and surrounding buildings into a strongpoint complex they intended to hold until ammunition exhausted. 300 defenders, well supplied with machine guns and Panzerfausts, positioned in stone buildings that had stood for 800 years. American forces, approaching from 3 directions, encountered fire from positions that covered every approach. Standard tactics, infantry assault supported by armour, resulted in heavy casualties. Altered tactics, massive artillery preparation followed by overwhelming assault destroyed much of the cathedral area but finally broke German resistance. The fighting lasted 6 hours on November 22nd. The concentrated violence reducing architectural treasures to rubble, killing German defenders who'd chosen to fight rather than surrender, and confirming that urban combat's costs exceeded even siege warfare against forts. German casualties in the final assault reflected the hopeless tactical situation defenders faced. Approximately 4,000 killed in action during November 20th through 22nd, 1/3 of the garrison's strength dying in defensive positions that couldn't be held against the firepower Third Army brought to bear. Wounded exceeded dead by perhaps 2-to-1 ratio, overwhelming the already inadequate German medical facilities. The garrison hospital, located in underground chambers beneath the city, received over 8,000 casualties in 72 hours, more than their peacetime capacity for a year. Doctors performed triage by candlelight, treating those who might survive immediate surgery, providing morphine to those who wouldn't, and watching men die from wounds that were survivable in any other context but were lethal when medical supplies didn't exist. American casualties, though significantly lower than German, were still substantial. 2,800 killed or wounded November 19th through 22nd, with the 5th Infantry Division bearing the heaviest burden as it fought through Metz's southern neighbourhoods. The casualty distribution revealed patterns. Infantry units suffered 70% of losses, despite being 40% of assault force. Combat engineers and flamethrower operators experienced casualty rates approaching 20%, the most dangerous assignments in an already dangerous operation. Tank destroyer crews, operating at close range in urban terrain, lost vehicles at rates that exceeded combat in open terrain by factors of 3 or 4. Urban combat consumed men and equipment with industrial efficiency. The bombardment scale exceeded anything previously delivered on the Western Front. 750,000 artillery shells fired over 4 days, 12,000 tons of high explosive, enough destructive power to physically reshape the city's geography. Entire neighborhoods ceased to exist as recognizable urban areas, becoming instead landscapes of rubble punctuated by shattered building facades. The Moselle River filled with debris, roads became impassable, canyons through mountains of collapsed masonry. Third Army engineers estimated that clearing Metz's streets to permit vehicle movement would require weeks of effort, bulldozers, explosives, and labor gangs working continuously. The city that had been military objective became humanitarian disaster requiring massive reconstruction effort. November 22nd, 1600 hours, General Kittle made his decision. The garrison could continue fighting perhaps another 24 hours before ammunition exhausted completely. Fighting to the last bullet, as Hitler ordered, meant watching men die uselessly when the outcome was already determined. Kittel, a professional officer trained in Wehrmacht traditions rather than Nazi fanaticism, chose to preserve lives rather than sacrifice them for symbolism. He ordered his remaining forces, approximately 8,000 effectives, still capable of resistance, to cease fire and prepare for surrender. The order went out by radio to forts and strong points still holding. Most complied immediately. Some, isolated from communications, continued fighting until American forces physically overran their positions. By nightfall, November 22nd, German resistance in Metz had effectively ended. The surrender itself was anticlimactic. After months of siege warfare, German soldiers emerged from positions throughout the city, weapons stacked in designated collection points, forming into columns for processing as prisoners of war. American soldiers, many of whom had fought since September to reach this moment, watched with exhausted relief rather than triumph. There were no celebrations, no dramatic flag-raising ceremonies, just the administrative processing of 12,000 prisoners, the beginning of casualty count and damage assessment, and overwhelming fatigue. Soldiers who'd endured 3 months of combat simply wanted to sleep, to eat hot food, to write letters home. The victory they'd achieved seemed distant from the cost required to achieve it. Fort Driant's final chapter epitomized the battle's ironies. Task Force Bacon, prepared for the assault that would finally reduce the position that had resisted since September, discovered the garrison had evacuated weeks earlier. American soldiers walked through the fortress unopposed, finding the elaborate tunnel systems, the defensive positions, the features that had made assault so costly. They also found evidence of the German evacuation supplies left behind, positions prepared for defense then abandoned, and most damning, logs showing the garrison had begun withdrawal planning in mid-October. The fort that had cost hundreds of American casualties in September and October had been considered expendable by its defenders, even while they killed Americans defending it. The revelation was bitter, all those deaths for a position the enemy was already planning to abandon. By November 23rd, Metz was in American hands. The fortress that had never fallen to direct assault in 1,500 years had finally been conquered. The cost was staggering. 7,000 American killed or wounded during the 3-month siege, 23,000 German casualties, 800 French civilian dead, and a city 40% destroyed by artillery and bombing. The operational achievement was real. Third Army had reduced one of Europe's most formidable fortress complexes and opened the road toward Germany. But the achievement came at a price that raised uncomfortable questions about whether the operation had been militarily necessary or strategically wise. Those questions would echo through historical analysis for generations. For the soldiers who'd fought the battle, the only relevant fact was that it was over. Finally, mercifully, devastatingly over. November 25th, 1944, Temporary Cemetery, 3 miles west of Metz. Chaplain Robert Morrison walked among rows of graves registration teams working in the sleet, identifying bodies recovered from the final assault, from October's fort battles, from September's early disasters. Some identifications were straightforward dog tags intact, features recognizable. Others required dental records, personal effects, or simply educated guesses based on unit assignments and where bodies were found. Morrison had conducted burial services throughout the campaign, but Metz's scale overwhelmed even his experience. 93 days of combat, 7,000 American casualties within Third Army's Metz operations, with total casualties including supporting units approaching 10,000. 2,000 graves already filled in this temporary cemetery, with more bodies still being recovered. The mathematics of siege warfare were brutal and simple. Taking an impregnable fortress required paying the price in lives, and Metz had extracted payment with interest. The casualty breakdown revealed patterns that spoke to the battle's character. 40% of casualties resulted from artillery, German guns firing from protected positions, delivering indirect fire against exposed American forces, 25% from small arms fire during assaults on fortifications and urban combat, 20% from mines and booby traps that claim victims randomly without regard for courage or tactical skill, 15% from environmental factors, cold exposure, disease, accidents related to operating in terrible conditions. The distribution showed a battle where defenders held most advantages: protected positions, prepared fields of fire, ability to inflict casualties while remaining relatively safe. American advantages in numbers and firepower eventually overwhelmed German defences, but the process consumed soldiers at rates that approached some of history's bloodiest battles. Medical statistics provided their own grim accounting. Field hospitals had treated over 15,000 casualties from all causes during the Metz campaign: combat wounds, disease, environmental injuries. Triage patterns evolved as the battle progressed. Early in the campaign, roughly 60% of wounded soldiers survived to return to duty. By November, survival rates had improved to 70% through better surgical techniques, faster evacuation, and accumulated experience. But the absolute numbers meant that even with improved survival rates, thousands of men suffered permanent disabilities. The 12th Evacuation Hospital's records documented 1,200 amputations, limbs destroyed by mines, artillery, or frostbite. 800 soldiers evacuated for psychiatric conditions that rendered them combat ineffective. The human cost extended far beyond those killed in action, to include thousands whose lives were permanently altered by wounds, physical and psychological. Trench foot cases approached 6,000 across Third Army during October and November, with Metz operations accounting for over half that total. The condition, entirely preventable with proper equipment and procedures, became epidemic through combination of terrible weather and inadequate logistics. Soldiers couldn't get dry socks because supply priorities allocated to ammunition and fuel. They couldn't rotate out of waterlogged positions because unit strengths were too low to permit relief. The result was thousands of preventable casualties, men losing feet, not to enemy action but to administrative failure and supply mismanagement. Post-battle investigations identified multiple systemic failures that allowed the epidemic, but those investigations came too late for soldiers who'd already lost limbs to gangrene. The replacement crisis that had been building since September reached critical mass by late November. 5th Infantry Division entered the Metz campaign at roughly 15,000 strength. By November 25th, effective strength had dropped to 11,000, 4,000 casualties, not fully replaced by the 3,200 replacements received. The division was combat effective, but significantly under strength. Similar patterns across the 90th and 95th Divisions meant that Third Army's infantry combat power had declined by roughly 25% during the Metz campaign. Rebuilding would require weeks of receiving and integrating replacements, retraining units, allowing veterans to recover from exhaustion. The strategic consequence was that Third Army, having finally taken Metz, was temporarily incapable of major offensive operations. Equipment losses provided their own measure of the battle's intensity. 280 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond field repair, more than some armoured division's entire strength. 450 other vehicles written off. 180 artillery pieces damaged, requiring depot-level maintenance. The losses occurred despite American material superiority, testament to how effectively German defensive fire targeted American equipment. Tank losses particularly concerned armour commanders. Replacing destroyed tanks was straightforward, but replacing experienced crews was impossible. Tank commanders who'd learned their trade in combat, who understood how to fight their vehicles effectively, couldn't be manufactured in training depots. Their loss diminished American armoured capability more than the loss of the tanks themselves. Comparative analysis placed Metz's costs in sobering context. The battle lasted 93 days and cost approximately 10,000 American casualties, counting all supporting units. Iwo Jima, infamous for its Butcher's Bill, lasted 36 days and cost 26,000 casualties. Okinawa cost 49,000 casualties over 82 days. On a per-day basis, Metz's casualty rate was lower than major Pacific battles, but the cumulative total approached the same magnitude. And unlike Pacific Islands, whose strategic value was debatable but whose seizure was operationally necessary for continuing advance, Metz might have been bypassed. That possibility that thousands had died for objectives that weren't absolutely necessary haunted after-action analysis and would fuel historical controversy for decades. The German butcher's bill exceeded American by significant margins: 23,000 casualties killed, wounded, captured from a garrison that never exceeded 15,000 at any point. The mathematics suggested either inflated figures or counting that included non-combat losses. The reality was both. German forces rotated through Metz throughout the siege, replacing units that had taken heavy casualties, and German record-keeping in the battle's final chaotic weeks was incomplete. But the order of magnitude was clear. Defending Metz had destroyed multiple German divisions' worth of combat power, removed experienced soldiers from Wehrmacht order of battle, and achieved Hitler's stated goal of tying down Allied forces at maximum cost. Whether that cost justified the outcome from German strategic perspective was questionable. The divisions consumed defending Metz might have been more valuable defending the Rhine or the Ruhr. Civilian casualties remained imprecisely documented, but certainly exceeded 800 killed with thousands more wounded. The deaths resulted from artillery bombardment, urban combat, disease in overcrowded shelters, and lack of medical care for chronic conditions. The civilian experience of Metz's siege, months underground, in darkness, limited food, constant bombardment, watching city destroyed, paralleled civilian experiences in Stalingrad, Warsaw, other cities that became battlefields. The psychological trauma extended to entire generations. Children who experienced the siege carried memories that shaped their lives. The city's liberation came at cost of its physical destruction and psychological scarring of its population. The final accounting reached beyond statistics to questions of strategic value and command responsibility. Had taking Metz been necessary? Could Third Army have contained the garrison while bypassing the fortress city? Would different operational approaches have achieved the same result at lower cost? Post-battle analysis by Third Army staff acknowledged that envelopment, if attempted in September rather than November, might have succeeded with fraction of casualties actually incurred. October's frontal assaults on forts had achieved minimal results at terrible cost. The learning curve from September's failures to November's successes had been steep, and soldiers' lives had purchased the lessons. Whether commanders bore responsibility for persisting in costly attacks when alternatives existed remained contentious. Military culture valued aggressive action, persistence in face of adversity, but at what point did persistence become pointless slaughter? Sergeant Eugene Luciano, 5th Infantry Division, now a staff sergeant through attrition-driven promotion, sat in a replacement depot writing his final letter from Metz. We took the city. We conquered the fortress that never fell. History books will call it a great victory. But I walked through the temporary cemetery yesterday and counted graves of men I knew, 43 from my original company alone. We started with 190 men in June. We have 68 left who were here from the beginning. The rest are dead, wounded so bad they won't return, or broken by combat exhaustion. We won, but I'm not sure what we won is worth what we paid. The brass says Metz was strategically vital, that we had to take it, that the casualties were necessary. Maybe they're right. Or maybe they're just telling themselves that so they can sleep at night. I don't know anymore. I just know that 43 men I called friends are dead, and Metz is rubble, and we're already getting orders for the next operation. The war continues, the dying continues, and all we can do is keep moving forward because going back isn't an option. December 1st, 1944, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, Command and General Staff College, Colonel S.L.A. Marshall stood before a classroom of officers, many of whom would deploy to Europe within months, and began his presentation on the Battle of Metz with uncomfortable honesty. Gentlemen, I've just returned from interviewing survivors of the Metz operation. What I'm about to describe represents one of the most costly learning experiences in American military history. We relearned lessons our army knew in 1918 and forgot in the interwar years. We purchased this knowledge with thousands of casualties that better institutional memory would have prevented. Your mission is to ensure these lessons are never forgotten again. The presentation that followed, based on hundreds of veteran interviews, would fundamentally reshape American doctrine for siege warfare, urban combat, and combined arms operations. The lessons were written in blood. The question was whether they'd be remembered. The doctrinal failures that made Metz so costly began with institutional amnesia. The American Expeditionary Force in World War I had developed sophisticated siege warfare techniques during the Meuse-Argonne offensive and operations against German fortified lines. Those techniques, specialized assault units, demolitions scaled for concrete fortifications, coordination between infantry artillery engineers had been extensively documented in after-action reports and training manuals, but the interwar army, focused on mobility and maneuver, had essentially discarded siege warfare doctrine as obsolete. When Third Army encountered Metz's fortifications, it had to rediscover techniques that had been Army knowledge 25 years earlier. The rediscovery process cost thousands of casualties and 3 months of combat. The creation of specialized assault doctrine represented Metz's most significant contribution to American military practice. Task Force Bacon's methods, combining infantry, engineers, tank destroyers, chemical mortars, and air support into integrated assault teams, became blueprint for reducing fortified positions. The doctrine emphasized several principles: reconnaissance and intelligence gathering before assault, artillery preparation focused on suppression rather than destruction, close-range direct fire from tank destroyers against embrasures, chemical mortars for creating untenable conditions inside fortifications, engineered demolitions for breaching, and infantry assault only after defenders were suppressed or disoriented. These principles were formalized in Field Manual 31-50, Combat in Fortified Areas, published in February 1945 and still in use decades later. Equipment modifications accelerated based on Metz experience. The 4.2-inch chemical mortar, which proved so effective at Fort Platteville and subsequent operations, received priority production and distribution to units likely to encounter fortified positions. Demolitions were reformulated, larger-shaped charges designed specifically for reinforced concrete, placement techniques that maximized effect against fortress walls. Flamethrower units expanded despite ethical concerns, because their effectiveness in tunnel and urban combat was undeniable. And perhaps most significantly, communications equipment designed for underground operations entered development radios that could function despite steel-reinforced concrete wire systems for maintaining contact when radio failed. The equipment changes reflected hard-won understanding that standard American gear was inadequate for siege warfare. The immediate application of Metz lessons came during Third Army's assault on the Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive fortifications. Operations that commanders predicted would take months using September's tactics succeeded in weeks using methods developed at Metz. The West Wall's fortifications, though formidable, were less sophisticated than Metz's 19th century forts. American forces, now trained in specialized assault techniques, reduced pillboxes and bunkers that would have been devastating obstacles in September. Casualty rates during Siegfried Line operations, while still substantial, were a fraction of what Metz had cost. The learning curve, purchased so expensively, saved lives in subsequent operations. Whether those lives saved justified the lives spent learning remained ethically ambiguous. Combined arms coordination evolved from theoretical concept to practical necessity through Metz experience. Pre-war doctrine discussed coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, but implementation was loose and improvisational. Metz forced precision. Tank destroyers had to fire at exact times to suppress positions without hitting advancing infantry. Artillery had to lift precisely when assault teams reached danger-close ranges. Air support had to deliver ordnance within margins measured in yards. Communications between elements had to function despite combat chaos. The coordination required wasn't just tactical, it was operational, requiring planning at division and corps level to ensure all elements had resources when needed. The sophistication achieved by November 1944 set standards for combined arms operations that influenced American military practice through subsequent conflicts. Intelligence gathering procedures changed fundamentally. The September assault on Fort Driant had proceeded with maps from 1918 and guesswork. November operations used current intelligence from prisoner interrogation, aerial reconnaissance, French resistance reports, and captured documents. American forces developed systematic approaches to fortress intelligence, identifying ventilation systems, water supplies, command posts, ammunition magazines, garrison strengths. The intelligence preparation was time-consuming, but essential time spent gathering intelligence reduced casualties during assault. The balance between speed and preparation became central to siege warfare doctrine. Attack too quickly without intelligence meant unnecessary casualties. Delay too long gave defenders time to strengthen positions. Finding the balance required judgment that couldn't be taught formally but could be informed by experience. The question of chemical weapons use remained unresolved in doctrine despite extensive employment at Metz. White phosphorus occupied legal grey area, permitted for smoke and illumination, questionable if used primarily to inflict casualties. American forces justified WP as creating untenable conditions that forced surrender without killing, saving both American and German lives. But the horrific wounds WP inflicted troubled some officers. The doctrine that emerged was cautious. Chemical weapons were tactically effective but ethically complex, permitted for specific applications but not as primary assault method. The ambiguity reflected larger tensions in American military culture, desire to minimize friendly casualties versus commitment to laws of war and ethical conduct. Metz demonstrated that ethical purity was luxury that operational necessity sometimes couldn't afford. Training programs transformed based on Metz experience. Infantry schools incorporated siege warfare into curricula. Engineer training emphasized demolitions for fortified structures. Artillery schools taught fortress reduction techniques. Chemical warfare schools expanded programs for mortar employment. The changes rippled through the replacement training system. Soldiers deploying to Europe in 1945 received instruction specifically about fortified position assault, lessons paid for by Casualties at Metz. Whether replacements adequately absorbed the training was questionable. Classroom instruction couldn't replicate combat's chaos, but at least the institutional knowledge existed and was being transmitted. The broader strategic lesson concerned the tension between prestige and military necessity. Metz had become a symbolic battlefield where considerations beyond pure military logic influenced decisions. Patton couldn't be seen as inactive. Hitler couldn't authorize abandonment of fortress cities. Both sides fought partly because their political systems demanded visible action, even when military rationality suggested alternatives. The lesson that political and psychological factors sometimes override operational wisdom was uncomfortable but necessary. War wasn't purely military calculation. It was political instrument, and political considerations sometimes meant accepting military inefficiencies or elevated costs. Understanding this reality, uncomfortable though it was, made commanders more effective by acknowledging constraints beyond their control. By spring 1945, Metz's lessons had been absorbed throughout American forces in Europe. Soldiers attacking German cities used tactics developed at Metz. Engineers reducing fortifications employed techniques refined there. Commanders planning operations considered whether objectives justified costs, whether alternatives to frontal assault existed. The learning had been expensive, but it had occurred. The question historians would debate was whether the expense had been necessary, whether an institution that better preserved its knowledge from the previous war could have avoided relearning lessons at such cost. That debate continues. What's certain is that Metz changed American military doctrine permanently, the lessons written in blood ensuring they wouldn't be forgotten as completely as World War I's lessons had been. July 20th, 2024, Fort Driant, France. James Peterson, aged 99, walks slowly through the tunnels he'd fought through 80 years earlier as a 19-year-old private in the 5th Infantry Division. The fort had been preserved as memorial, its corridors and rooms maintained as they'd been during the battle, a reminder of what siege warfare had cost. Peterson's hands, gnarled with age, touched concrete walls scarred by bullets and explosions. He remembered these tunnels in darkness, remembered the terror of not knowing if Germans were ahead or behind, remembered friends dying in rooms he was now walking through in peaceful silence. A French guide, respectful and patient, asked if he wanted to rest. Peterson shook his head. He'd come back to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that someone still alive could describe what had happened here when all the history books and documents were abstractions from direct experience. He was the last of his company still living. When he died, Metz's battle would exist only in historical record, no longer in living memory. The historical consensus on Metz, developed through 8 decades of scholarship and analysis, acknowledges the battle as strategically questionable but tactically essential for American learning. The fortress city could likely have been bypassed, contained rather than conquered, its garrison isolated and rendered irrelevant without the 3-month siege that cost 10,000 American casualties. Archival research after the war revealed that German forces lacked the resources to make Metz an active threat to American supply lines. The garrison was defensive, not offensive, capability. Intelligence at the time overestimated the threat, and political considerations overrode military calculations. But the siege, however unnecessary strategically, forced American forces to develop siege warfare doctrine, urban combat techniques, and combined arms coordination that saved lives in subsequent operations. The question of whether those future lives saved justified the lives spent at Metz remains ethically unresolvable. The long-term impact on military doctrine extended far beyond World War II. American forces in Korea, facing fortified positions across mountainous terrain, employed techniques developed at Metz. Vietnam's urban combat, Hue City, most notably utilized assault tactics refined there. Desert Storm's reduction of Iraqi fortifications reflected institutional knowledge traced directly to Metz's lessons. Operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, where American forces encountered fortified compounds and urban strongpoints, drew on doctrine whose roots lay in November 1944's fighting. The lineage was clear. Metz had permanently changed how American forces approached fortified position assault. Whether that justified Metz's cost depended on how one calculated the value of institutional knowledge versus the price of acquiring it. Patton's reputation sustained lasting damage from Metz despite his subsequent successes. His memoirs, War as I Knew It, devoted only brief passages to the siege, focusing instead on the November breakthrough and subsequent advance toward the Rhine. The omission spoke volumes. Metz represented everything Patton's philosophy opposed: slow, grinding, attritional warfare against static defences. It contradicted his image as master of mobile warfare, the general who won through speed and audacity. Historical analysis acknowledges Patton's operational brilliance in the November envelopment, but questions why that brilliance wasn't applied 2 months earlier, before October's costly siege warfare. The answer likely lies in combination of supply constraints, strategic directives from Eisenhower, and Patton's own belief that aggressive persistence would eventually succeed. Whether different choices would have produced better outcomes remains counterfactual speculation. The French memory of Metz's liberation reflects complicated relationship with the battle's legacy. The city celebrates liberation annually, honouring American soldiers who freed it from German occupation. But the celebration coexists with recognition that liberation came at terrible cost. 40% of the city destroyed, 800 civilians killed, architectural treasures reduced to rubble. The preservation of forts as memorials serves dual purpose, honouring sacrifices made and warning against war's costs. French historical interpretation emphasizes Metz's position as victim of great power conflict, a city that didn't choose to be fortress, didn't choose to be battlefield, suffered the consequences of decisions made by distant governments and generals. The interpretation isn't wrong, merely incomplete. It captures civilian experience while necessarily simplifying military complexity. Strategic alternatives analysis, examining what might have happened if Third Army had bypassed Metz, suggests the siege wasn't operationally necessary, but may have been strategically valuable. Containing Metz would have required significant American forces maintaining encirclement, forces unavailable for offensive operations elsewhere. The garrison, if supplied by air or occasional ground convoys, might have resisted for months, tying down American divisions. Taking Metz eliminated that requirement, freeing forces for advance toward the Rhine. Additionally, the psychological impact of conquering the fortress that had never fallen shouldn't be dismissed. Military operations have psychological and political dimensions beyond pure tactical calculation. Metz's fall damaged German morale while boosting Allied confidence. Whether those intangible effects justified tangible costs is matter of interpretation. The ethical questions Metz raises resist comfortable resolution. Did commanders bear responsibility for persisting in frontal assaults when alternatives existed? Should Patton have halted October's operations when casualty rates made cost obvious? Could Eisenhower have provided resources for bypass operations rather than siege? Each question has multiple valid answers depending on values prioritized. Aggressive action versus casualty conservation, strategic persistence versus tactical flexibility, political considerations versus purely military logic. Military ethics scholarship uses Metz as case study precisely because it illuminates tensions between competing values. The battle provides no clear lessons about right and wrong, only complex examples of difficult decisions made under extreme pressure with imperfect information. The contemporary relevance of Metz extends to current military operations. Urban warfare remains among the most costly and complex forms of combat. Fortified positions, whether 19th century concrete or 21st century improvised compounds, continue challenging attackers. The balance between firepower and precision, between speed and deliberation, between accepting casualties and risking mission failure, remains central to military planning. Metz's lessons about combined arms coordination, specialized assault units, intelligence preparation, and ethical use of overwhelming force inform current doctrine. The battle's relevance isn't historical curiosity. its living tradition informing how American forces approach similar challenges. The memorial at Fort Driant contains a simple inscription in French and English: "Here men fought for freedom. Here men died for liberation. Remember their sacrifice." Question the necessity of war. The inscription captures the dual imperative: honoring sacrifice while acknowledging war's costs, respecting courage while questioning decisions that required it. Peterson, reading the inscription he'd read before on previous visits, felt the weight of memory. He remembered men whose names appeared on memorial plaques, remembered their faces and voices in ways no document could preserve. He remembered the terror and courage, the confusion and clarity, the waste and necessity. History would debate Metz's strategic value. He knew only that friends had died there, that they'd believed the mission mattered, and that their sacrifice deserved remembrance, even if their mission's necessity remained debatable. Walking back through Fort Driant's tunnels toward daylight, Peterson encountered a young American soldier, part of a military history staff ride, studying World War II operations. The soldier, recognizing Peterson's veteran status from the cap he wore, asked what the battle had been like. Peterson considered the question, searching for words that could convey experience to someone who'd never lived it. "Imagine being told to attack something everyone says is impossible to take," he finally said. "Imagine watching friends die trying. Then imagine doing it anyway, because orders are orders, and someone has to. We succeeded. We took the fortress. But I've spent 80 years wondering if we had to, or if we just did, because no one was willing to admit there might be another way." The young soldier nodded, uncertain how to respond. Peterson didn't expect response. Some questions didn't have answers. Some wounds didn't heal. Some memories didn't fade. Metz was all free. The verdict of history remains divided, will likely remain divided, because Metz resists simple categorization, necessary or unnecessary, triumph or tragedy, brilliant or wasteful. The truth encompasses all possibilities simultaneously. The battle was necessary given the strategic, political, and psychological context of November 1944. It was unnecessary by purely military calculation if different strategies had been pursued 2 months earlier. It was triumph in that American forces conquered fortress thought impregnable. It was tragedy in that thousands died achieving objectives of questionable ultimate value. It was brilliant in November's envelopment operations. It was wasteful in October's frontal assaults. Accepting these contradictions, refusing to reduce complex reality to simple narrative, honors those who fought more authentically than any attempt to declare definitive judgment. As Peterson left Fort Driant for the last time, he knew at 99 this visit would be his final one. He paused at the memorial to read names of men from his company. 43 names. 43 lives ended in this fortress during autumn 1944. The historical debate about whether their deaths were necessary would continue long after he was gone. For Peterson, the only certainty was that they'd been real people, scared, young men who'd done what was asked of them, who'd fought with courage they didn't know they possessed, who died believing their sacrifice mattered. Whether historians ultimately judged Metz as necessary or wasteful, triumph or tragedy, couldn't change that fundamental reality. The men were dead, their courage was real, their memory deserved preservation, everything else was interpretation. And interpretation, Peterson had learned across 8 decades, was the work of the living. The dead had already given their answer in the only way possible, with their lives. It was left to the living to determine what those lives had purchased, and whether the price had been worth paying.